Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. This happened to me back in 2012, when I was working the night shift at a gas station just outside Bakersfield, California. I was 23, fresh out of college, and desperately needed the money to pay off my student loans. The job paid well enough for overnight work, and I figured how hard could it be. The station sat right off Highway 99, surrounded by nothing but desert scrub and darkness. During my shift, which ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I'd get maybe a dozen customers, mostly long-haul truckers, the occasional late-night traveler, or someone needing to use the restroom. The isolation never bothered me much. I had my books, my music, and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights to keep me company. That particular night started like any other. I was ringing up a customer, some guy buying energy drinks and beef jerky, when another man walked in. He looked to be in his late 30s, tall and stocky, wearing a faded denim jacket. Something about him immediately put me on edge, though I couldn't pinpoint what. He walked straight to the back of the store where we kept the refrigerated drinks, moving with this deliberate, almost predatory stride. I finished with my current customer, who grabbed his bag and headed out into the night. The bell above the door chimed as it closed, leaving just me and the stranger. I waited behind the counter, expecting him to bring something up to purchase, but he just stood there in the back aisle. Through the security mirror mounted in the corner, I could see him staring at the cooler doors, not moving, not reaching for anything. Just standing there. "Can I help you find something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. That's when he turned around. His eyes locked onto mine through the mirror, and I felt my blood run cold. There was something wrong with his stare. It was intense, predatory, filled with a kind of cold calculation that made my skin crawl. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse right before the kill. He started walking toward the counter, never breaking eye contact. As he got closer, I noticed dark stains on his jacket and hands. At first, I thought it might be motor oil or chocolate, but as he stepped under the harsh fluorescent lights, I realized with horror that it was blood. Fresh blood. "Is everything all right, sir?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking slightly. He didn't answer. He just kept walking toward me with that terrible smile spreading wider across his face. I could see dried blood under his fingernails, spatters across his cheek that he hadn't bothered to wipe away. My fight-or-flight response kicked in hard. I backed away from the register, keeping my eyes on him as I slowly moved toward the exit. Every instinct I had was screaming that this man meant to hurt me, badly. "I'm going to need you to leave," I said, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my words, but kept advancing. When I reached the door, I made a run for it, bursting out into the cool night air and sprinting toward my Honda Civic in the parking lot. But when I got there, my heart sank. All 4 tires had been slashed, long, deliberate cuts that left them completely flat. He'd been planning this. This was back when cell phones weren't as common, and mine was sitting on the charger inside the store. The landline was my only option, but that meant going back inside with him. I looked around desperately, hoping to see headlights on the highway, but the road was empty. Not a single car in sight. Through the store windows, I could see him standing at the counter now, still watching me with that predatory stare. He wasn't in any hurry. He knew I was trapped. I decided to circle around to the back of the building. There was a rear entrance that I'd locked earlier, but maybe I could find another way in, or at least hide until someone came by. But when I rounded the corner, I nearly vomited. There was a body lying in the shadows behind the dumpster. A man, maybe in his 50s, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. He was naked from the waist up, and there was so much blood that the gravel beneath him had turned black. His eyes stared sightlessly at the desert sky. I screamed. I couldn't help it. The sound tore from my throat before I could stop it, echoing off the concrete walls of the building. When I spun around to run back to the front, the killer was gone from the window. Panic set in completely. I crept along the side of the building, trying to see where he'd gone. The front of the store appeared empty, so I made a desperate decision. I ran for the entrance, yanked the door open, and dove inside, immediately locking it behind me. The store felt different now, menacing, full of shadows and hiding places. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. He'd cut the phone cables. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a brightly lit box with a killer somewhere in the darkness outside. Through the large front windows, I could see him now, standing about 20 feet from the entrance. Just standing there, watching, waiting. He looked like he was enjoying this, the cat-and-mouse game, the psychological torture. His smile had grown even wider, showing yellowed, crooked teeth. There was something profoundly wrong with his eyes, something that spoke of violence and madness. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Me inside, him outside, neither of us moving. I could feel myself starting to crack under the pressure. My hands were shaking, my breathing was shallow, and I kept thinking about that body behind the building. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a pair of scissors from behind the counter. They were small, probably useless, but they were better than nothing. I had to try to make a run for it. Maybe I could flag down a passing car, or maybe I could outrun him in the desert. Anything was better than waiting for him to decide it was time to end this game. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door. The moment I stepped outside, his smile grew impossibly wider. He pulled a hunting knife from his jacket, a massive, serrated blade that glinted under the parking lot lights. "What do you want?" I shouted at him. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me, then another. I raised the scissors, knowing how pathetic they looked compared to his weapon. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of an engine. Headlights appeared on the highway, getting closer. A car was pulling into the station. It was an older man in a beat-up pickup truck. He parked at the pumps and started walking toward the store, probably to pay for gas. I tried to warn him, screaming at him to get back in his truck, to drive away, to call for help. But it was too late. The killer moved with shocking speed. Before the old man could even process what was happening, the knife was buried in his chest. I watched in horror as he collapsed, and the killer dragged his body toward the back of the building, leaving a trail of blood across the asphalt. I should have run then. I should have sprinted into the desert while he was distracted. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the brutality I just witnessed. My body simply wouldn't respond to my brain's desperate commands to move. When he came back, he moved the old man's truck next to my car and slashed those tires too. Then he resumed his position in front of the store, that terrible smile never leaving his face. Something inside me finally snapped. The paralysis broke, and I was filled with a desperate, animal need to survive. I ran for the back door, fumbling with my keys as I heard his heavy footsteps pursuing me. I got the door open and sprinted into the desert, branches tearing at my clothes, rocks cutting my feet through my sneakers. He was right behind me. I could hear his breathing, could practically feel his presence. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, but I kept running toward the highway, hoping against hope that someone would see me. My lungs were burning, my legs were cramping, but I pushed forward. Behind me, his footsteps were getting closer. I could hear him breathing hard now, could hear the crunch of gravel under his boots. Then, like a miracle, I saw flashing red and blue lights in the distance. A police cruiser was coming down the highway. I screamed and waved my arms, running toward the road with every ounce of strength I had left. The footsteps behind me suddenly stopped. When I turned around, he was gone, vanished into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. The police found me collapsed on the shoulder of the highway, sobbing and incoherent. It took them several minutes to calm me down enough to understand what I was saying. When they went to investigate the gas station, they found the two bodies, but no sign of the killer. Later at the police station, they showed me a photograph. The man in the picture was older than the one I'd encountered, but the eyes were unmistakable cold, calculating, utterly without humanity. "Is this him?" the detective asked. I nodded, unable to speak. They told me he was an escaped patient from Patton State Hospital, about 40 miles away. He'd been committed there 15 years earlier for multiple homicides, but had somehow managed to escape during a transport. They'd been hunting him for 3 days when he found me. "You're lucky," the detective said. "He's killed 7 people that we know of. You're the first one to get away." They caught him 2 days later, hiding in an abandoned barn about 10 miles from the gas station. He's back in maximum security now, but I still have nightmares about that smile. I still wake up sometimes, convinced I can see him standing outside my bedroom window. I went to therapy for years after that night. It helped, but some experiences leave scars that never fully heal. I learned something important, though sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed or lurking in ghost stories. Sometimes they're walking among us, wearing human faces, waiting for the right moment to reveal what they really are. The living can be far more terrifying than any spirit or supernatural entity, because the living can choose to be evil. And that choice, that deliberate embrace of cruelty and violence, is the most frightening thing of all. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Marcus, and I've been a night shift worker most of my adult life. There's something about the quiet hours between midnight and dawn that appeals to me. Fewer people, less chaos, just me, and whatever task needs doing. So when I got hired at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix back in 2015, I thought I'd found the perfect job. The station sat at the junction of 2 desert highways, about 30 miles from the city center. During the day, it was busy enough with commuters and travelers, but at night, it became a different place entirely. Most nights, I'd see maybe 4 or 5 customers during my entire 8-hour shift. Long-haul truckers mostly, or the occasional insomniac needing energy drinks and cigarettes. I was 26 then, putting myself through community college during the day and working nights to pay for it. The isolation didn't bother me. It gave me plenty of time to study between customers. I'd set up my textbooks behind the counter and work on assignments while monitoring the security cameras and waiting for the rare customer to wander in. It was a Tuesday night in October when everything changed. I remember because I had a geology exam the next day and was cramming sedimentary rock formations when she walked in. She appeared ordinary enough at first glance, a woman in her 30s, well-dressed in a navy blue business suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. It looked like she'd just come from an office meeting or dinner party. But there was something off about her presence, something that made the air in the store feel heavier. She walked directly to the back of the store, past the snack aisles and drink coolers, and just stopped. Through the security mirror, I could see her standing motionless at the far end of the last aisle, staring out the back window into the empty desert. She wasn't browsing, wasn't looking at products, just standing there like a statue. I waited for her to move, to grab something and come to the counter, but minutes passed and she remained frozen in place. I pulled out my earbuds and watched her more carefully. Something was definitely wrong. "Excuse me, ma'am," I called out. "Can I help you find anything?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken, just kept staring out that back window into the darkness. I stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward her, my footsteps echoing in the empty store. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. She was barefoot. Her feet were dirty, cut up, bleeding in places. How had I missed that when she walked in? "Ma'am, are you all right?" Still no response. I followed her gaze to see what she was looking at, but there was nothing outside except empty desert and the distant glow of Phoenix on the horizon. No cars in the parking lot, no movement anywhere. That's when it hit me. How had she gotten here? We were 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and cactus. Even if someone had dropped her off, where was their car? The parking lot was empty except for my old Toyota. "How did you get here?" I asked, louder this time. For the first time, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide with terror, filled with a fear so profound it made me take a step back. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He's coming for me." Who's coming for you?" Didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the window and began to cry deep, soul-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere sadness. It was the sound of someone who'd lost everything. I immediately locked the front door and called 911. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit, but it would take at least 25 minutes to reach our location. I hung up and tried to comfort the woman, but she'd gone silent again, just staring out that window with tears streaming down her face. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept behind the counter. You never know what kind of trouble might find you in a place like this, and went outside to check the perimeter. The desert night was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of highway traffic and the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. No sign of anyone else around. When I came back inside, she was gone. I searched everywhere, the bathroom, the storage room, behind every aisle. She couldn't have left through the front door because I would have seen her, and the back door was locked from the inside. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. Confused and increasingly unsettled, I decided to check the security footage. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe there was another explanation. But when I pulled up the recordings from the past hour, what I saw made my blood freeze. There on the screen, plain as day, was a dark figure standing outside the back window, all draped in what looked like a long black coat or cloak, completely motionless. The figure had been there from the moment the woman entered the store, watching her through the glass. But here's the thing that really got to me. When I'd gone outside just minutes earlier, I'd walked right past that spot. There had been nothing there. I rewound the footage and watched it again. The cloaked figure appeared the instant the woman walked into the store and remained there, unmoving, until the moment I'd gone outside. And it simply faded away, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. I saved the video file, my hands shaking as I worked the controls. No one was going to believe this without proof. A few minutes later, I saw headlights pulling into the parking lot. 2 police officers got out of their cruiser and approached the store. When I let them in, they seemed puzzled. "We got here as fast as we could," the older officer said. "Dispatch said you had a disturbance." "That's weird," I said. "They told me it would be 25 minutes, but it's only been about 10. The younger officer shrugged. "We were already in the area, had to respond to a fatal accident about 2 miles down the highway. Single vehicle rollover happened maybe 20 minutes ago." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I explained about the woman, showed them the security footage. Were skeptical about the cloaked figure, said it was probably just shadows and poor lighting playing tricks on the camera. Without the woman there to file a complaint or press charges, there wasn't much they could do. They did a quick sweep of the area, found nothing unusual, and advised me to keep the doors locked for the rest of my shift. After they left, I tried to focus on my geology notes, but I couldn't concentrate. Something about their timing bothered me. Why had they been so close? What were the odds? The rest of the night passed without incident. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I headed home, eager to get some sleep before my afternoon classes. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking about the woman's terrified eyes, about that figure in the footage, about the timing of everything. Around noon, unable to rest, I picked up my phone and started browsing local news sites. That's when I found it, the story about the accident the officers had mentioned. Local business executive dies in highway rollover. Headline was accompanied by a photo that made my heart stop. It was her, the woman from the gas station. According to the article, Amanda Chen, 34, had been driving home from a client dinner when she lost control of her BMW on a curve. The accident had occurred at approximately 1:45 a.m., just minutes before she'd walked into my store. But that was impossible. The accident site was 2 miles away. Even if she'd somehow survived the initial crash, she couldn't have walked that distance in her condition, not barefoot and injured, not in just a few minutes. I read the article 3 times, checking and rechecking the timeline. Amanda Chen had been pronounced dead at the scene by paramedics who arrived at 2:10 a.m. But she'd been in my store, alive and breathing, at 2:20. The rational part of my mind tried to find explanations. Maybe the clocks were wrong, maybe I'd misread the time, maybe it was a different woman who just happened to look similar. But deep down, I knew the truth. Amanda Chen had died in that rollover, but somehow, some part of her had made it to my gas station. She'd been running from something, that dark figure I'd seen in the footage. Running from death itself, trying to find somewhere safe, somewhere she could hide from the inevitable. "He's coming for me," she'd whispered. I thought about that cloaked figure standing outside the window, patient and motionless, waiting for her to accept what had already happened. Death had come for Amanda Chen on that desert highway, but she'd fought it, fled from it, sought refuge in the last place she could find. But you can't hide from death forever. Eventually, it finds you. I never saw her again, but sometimes, When I'm driving past that stretch of highway where she died, I think about her. I wonder if she found peace, if she finally stopped running. I wonder if that dark figure is still out there, waiting patiently for the next person who refuses to go quietly into that final night. The experience changed me. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before, the way shadows fall in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched when no one's around, the thin places where our world touches something else entirely. I still work night shifts, but I'm more careful now. I keep my eyes open, stay alert for signs that something isn't quite right. Because I learned that night that death doesn't always announce itself with car crashes or heart attacks. Sometimes it's patient, following at a distance, giving its prey a chance to run. But in the end, everyone's race has the same finish line. The only question is how long you can keep running, and whether you'll face the inevitable with dignity or spend your final moments in desperate flight from the unavoidable. Amanda Chen chose to run. And for a few precious minutes in a desert gas station, she almost made me believe she could outrun the darkness forever. I'm telling you this story because it happened to me, and because even now, 15 years later, I still wake up some nights hearing their laughter. My name is David, and back in 2008, I was working the graveyard shift at a gas station convenience store in a small town called Cedar Falls, about 40 minutes outside of Denver, Colorado. I was 24 then, putting myself through college during the day and working nights to pay the bills. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent money for overnight work, and I'd always been a night owl anyway. The station was located right at the edge of town, where the suburban neighborhoods gave way to farmland and forest. During my shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I'd maybe see a dozen customers on a busy night. Most of the locals knew me by then. I'd been working there for about 8 months, and Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. The people were friendly, the work was easy, and I had plenty of time to study between customers. It seemed like the perfect setup. The building itself was fairly new. They'd constructed it maybe 5 years earlier to replace an older structure that had been torn down. It was a standard layout, main retail area up front, with a narrow hallway leading to a storage room in the back where we kept excess inventory and supplies. Nothing unusual about it, or so I thought. The first time I heard them, I was restocking the beer coolers around 11:30 on a Tuesday night. It was quiet, no customers, just the hum of refrigerators and the distant sound of highway traffic. I was arranging cases of Coors when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the storage room. I paused, listening carefully. The footsteps came again light, quick, like someone small moving around back there. My first thought was that maybe we had mice or rats, though the steps seemed too deliberate, too purposeful for rodents. I walked down the narrow hallway to the storage room and flipped on the light. Boxes of merchandise lined the walls, everything neat and organized just as I'd left it during my previous shift. No sign of any disturbance, no indication that anything was out of place. I was about to turn off the light when I heard something that made my skin crawl, the sound of children giggling. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere within that room. I stepped inside, moving boxes aside, checking every corner but found nothing. Shaking my head, I returned to my restocking duties, telling myself it was probably just pipes settling or sounds carrying from outside. Old buildings make weird noises, right? But deep down, I knew what I'd heard wasn't normal. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time, the footsteps were accompanied by whispered voices, children's voices, speaking too quietly for me to make out words. I grabbed a flashlight and searched the storage room more thoroughly, even checking behind the largest boxes and supply shelves. Nothing. When the sounds came a third time around 1 a.m., they were different. Instead of whispers and giggles, I heard what sounded like a child sobbing quietly, heartbroken and afraid. The sound was so mournful, so filled with despair, that I actually felt tears welling up in my own eyes. I was standing in the hallway, listening to this impossible crying, when the bell above the front door chimed. A customer had arrived, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived nearby and often stopped by during my shifts for coffee and conversation. "Evening, David," she said with a warm smile. "How are you doing tonight?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson," I replied, though I'm sure my voice sounded strained. "Just having a quiet night." She studied my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 6 children and knew when something was bothering a young person. "You look troubled, honey. Everything all right?" I hesitated, then decided to tell her about the sounds. What did I have to lose? Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed deeply and shook her head. "I was wondering when this would start happening again," she said. "You're not the first employee to hear things in this place, David. Probably won't be the last either." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson glanced around the store, as if checking to make sure we were alone, then leaned closer to the counter. "This land has a dark history, honey. What I'm about to tell you isn't common knowledge. Most folks in town prefer not to talk about it, but you have a right to know." She went on to explain that before the gas station was built, the property had been home to a large Victorian house belonging to the Whitmore family. Robert Whitmore had been the town's mayor back in the 1970s, a respected man with a beautiful wife named Catherine and twin children, a boy and girl named Timothy and Sarah. They were 7 years old, apparently bright and happy kids who were well loved in the community. But Catherine Whitmore had begun showing signs of severe mental illness. She heard voices, saw things that weren't there, became convinced that people were plotting against her and her family. Robert tried to get her help, taking her to specialists in Denver. But this was the 70s. Mental health treatment wasn't what it is today. The tragedy occurred on a cold February night when Robert was away on business. Catherine, in the grip of a psychotic episode, became convinced that evil forces were coming to harm her children. In her twisted logic, she decided the only way to protect Timothy and Sarah was to take them to heaven before the evil could reach them. She smothered both children in their sleep, then barricaded herself in the house. When Robert returned 2 days later, he found the horrific scene. Catherine was catatonic, sitting in the children's bedroom, still holding their bodies. She was committed to a psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death 20 years later. Robert, devastated by grief, abandoned the house and moved away. The property sat empty for decades, slowly falling into ruin. Local kids claimed it was haunted, and most adults avoided the area entirely. Eventually, the city condemned the old house and had it demolished. The gas station was built on the exact spot where the Whitmore home had stood, right where those children had died. "The storage room," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, "is built over what used to be Timothy and Sarah's bedroom." I felt a chill run down my spine. Have other employees experienced things? Every night shift worker we've had has reported strange occurrences. Most quit within a few weeks. You've lasted longer than most. I think it's because you're not easily frightened, and the children can sense that. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver cross on a chain. "My grandmother gave this to me when I was about your age. It's been blessed by 3 different pastors over the years. I want you to have it." I started to protest, but she insisted. "Those children aren't evil, David." They're just lost, confused, probably frightened. But their mother's madness left a mark on this place, and sometimes that darkness tries to influence them. The cross will help keep you safe and maybe provide them with some comfort too. After Mrs. Patterson left, I put the cross around my neck and tried to focus on my studies. But I couldn't concentrate. Every small sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move on its own. Around 3 a.m., the sounds started again. This time, though, they were different. Instead of crying or whispering, I heard what sounded like children playing running footsteps, muffled laughter, the kinds of sounds you'd hear from kids having fun in another room. I walked to the storage room doorway and stood there listening. The sounds were definitely coming from inside, but they seemed happier than before, less desperate. I found myself smiling slightly, imagining 2 7-year-olds playing some innocent game in the afterlife. Then the temperature in the hallway dropped dramatically. My breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the playful sounds transformed into something else screaming. Not the joyful shrieks of children at play, but genuine terror. It was the sound of kids in mortal danger, calling for help that would never come. I backed away from the storage room, my heart pounding. The lights throughout the store began to flicker, and I could feel a presence watching me from the darkness of that hallway. Something cold and malevolent, something that definitely wasn't the innocent spirits of 2 murdered children. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a woman's voice, harsh, angry, filled with madness. "They're mine," the voice hissed. "My babies. No one can have them. No one can take them from me." I realized I was hearing Catherine Whitmore, or what was left of her. The children might be trapped here, but so was their mother, still convinced in death that she was protecting them from some imaginary threat. "Get away from them," I shouted into the darkness. "Leave those kids alone." The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath now in thick white puffs. The fluorescent lights overhead began to strobe frantically, and somewhere in the storage room, boxes started falling over with loud crashes. I grabbed the cross Mrs. Patterson had given me and held it tight, saying every prayer I could remember from my childhood. The chaos continued for several more seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The light steadied, the temperature returned to normal, and an eerie quiet settled over the store. But in that silence, I heard something that broke my heart, the sound of 2 children crying softly, hopelessly, like they'd been crying for 30 years and would cry for 30 more. I made a decision that probably saved my sanity. Instead of running, instead of quitting like every other night shift worker, I walked to the storage room doorway and spoke gently into the darkness. "Timothy, Sarah, my name is David. I know you're scared, and I know someone hurt you a long time ago. But you don't have to be afraid anymore. Your mom is sick, and she doesn't understand what she's doing. You're safe now." The crying gradually stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. And so faintly I almost missed it, I heard a small voice whisper, "Thank you." The rest of my shift passed peacefully. No more sounds, no more cold spots, no more falling boxes. Just the normal quiet of a late-night gas station. I worked there for another 3 months before graduating and moving on to a better job. During that time, I occasionally heard the children, usually just footsteps or quiet giggling. But never again did I encounter the malevolent presence of their mother. It was as if acknowledging their suffering, showing them compassion instead of fear, had somehow weakened her hold on them. Mrs. Patterson told me later that the new night shift employee, a guy named Rick, quit after just 2 weeks, claiming the place was haunted. She smiled sadly when she told me this. "Some people can help troubled spirits find peace," she said. "Others just make the situation worse. You were good for those children, David. I hope you gave them a little comfort." I like to think I did. I hope that Timothy and Sarah Whitmore finally found some measure of peace, and that their mother's madness no longer has the power to torment them. But I also know that some wounds are too deep to heal completely, some tragedies too profound to simply move on from. Late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I sometimes think I can still hear them, two children who died too young, still playing in the shadows of a world that forgot them. And sometimes, if I listen very carefully, I swear I can hear them laughing instead of crying. That has to count for something, doesn't it? If there's one thing that absolutely terrifies me, it's those isolated gas stations you find scattered along remote highways. I know it might sound strange, but there's a very real reason for my fear. It happened during a business trip I had to make to Denver. Due to my poor time management that day, I ended up leaving just as the sun was setting, which meant darkness would soon engulf me on the interstate. By the time I reached the lonelier stretch of Highway 76, it was already past 2 in the morning. I was driving through this desolate section that would eventually lead me to my destination when I spotted the glow of a gas station in the distance. The fuel gauge was getting dangerously low, so I decided to make a quick stop to fill up, stretch my legs, and grab something from the convenience store. The place looked normal enough at first glance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the parking lot. I even noticed fresh oil stains on the asphalt, suggesting recent activity. But what struck me as odd was the complete absence of any attendants around the pumps. I figured they were probably in the restroom or taking a break in the back office. I parked next to pump number 3 and walked toward the convenience store, hoping to find some coffee and maybe a sandwich. But what I discovered inside that store is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Scattered throughout the aisles, between the candy bars and motor oil displays, were several white marble crosses. The kind you typically see erected at roadside memorials where someone died in an accident. There were at least 6 or 7 of them placed randomly throughout the store, and behind the cash register stood the largest one, adorned with wilted flowers and a faded photograph. My heart started pounding as I backed toward the door. I practically ran outside, only to realize that the gas pump area was also dotted with these memorial crosses. Some were small and simple, others were elaborate with engraved names and dates. They were everywhere by the air pump near the dumpster, scattered across the entire parking lot like a cemetery. I jumped into my car and floored the accelerator, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I drove for another 40 minutes before finding another gas station, this one brightly lit and bustling with late-night travelers. After I filled up and calmed down enough to speak coherently, I mentioned my experience to the night clerk. His face grew serious as he leaned across the counter. "You talking about that old Shell station about 30 miles back?" he asked. "Man, you're lucky you got out of there. That place has been abandoned for years, ever since that massacre." He went on to explain that 5 years earlier, a group of armed men had robbed the station during the night shift. When the employees and 2 customers tried to comply with their demands, something went wrong. All 7 people inside were killed execution style. The families had placed memorial crosses all around the property, and despite the owner's attempts to remove them, they kept reappearing. "The weird thing is," the clerk continued, "people still report seeing lights on there like it's still operating. But trust me, nobody's worked there since that night." A chill ran down my spine as I realized this was my first encounter with something truly supernatural. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be my last. 4 years ago, when I was 17, something happened to me that I still can't logically explain. To this day, it fills me with terror. It was during spring break, and we were driving to visit my grandparents who lived in a small town outside of Phoenix. The journey typically took about 6 hours, so my parents decided to start the trip at 2 in the morning to arrive by 8 and make the most of our vacation day. The entire route was eerily desolate. We passed through nothing but desert scrubland and the occasional abandoned building. There was only one small truck stop community along the way, which gave the whole journey an almost post-apocalyptic atmosphere. About an hour into the drive, my father announced that we needed to find a gas station soon since we only had a quarter tank left, and that wouldn't be enough to reach our destination. At 3:30 in the morning, we finally spotted the neon lights of a travel center in the distance. Both my mother and I breathed a sigh of relief because for the past hour, all we'd seen were Joshua trees and rocky outcroppings illuminated by our headlights. When we pulled up to the station, my father went to pump gas, while my mother headed into the store to buy some snacks for the road. I decided to use the restroom since I'd been holding it for quite a while. I won't lie, the darkness and the cold desert air were already making me nervous, and I had this unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. I quickly made my way to the women's restroom, which was located on the side of the building. Just as I was about to come out of the stall, I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps outside. The sound made me freeze for several seconds, but when I finally managed to move toward the door, I heard the outer door slam shut with tremendous force. This terrified me beyond reason, and I began screaming and crying while desperately calling for my mother and father. What made it even worse was that from the other side of the door, I could hear someone laughing, a loud, mocking laugh that seemed to echo off the tile walls. This went on for several agonizing minutes, me screaming in terror while that horrible laughter grew louder and more menacing. Then suddenly, the door swung open. I didn't think twice. I bolted out of there and ran straight to where my parents were standing by our car. They asked if something had happened, and I told them no, but that I really wanted to leave immediately. To this day, I don't know what occurred in that restroom. Maybe it was someone's idea of a cruel joke, or maybe it was something supernatural. All I know for certain is that whenever we take road trips now, I insist we travel during daylight hours or make sure the tank is full before we leave. The thought of hearing that sinister laughter again fills me with dread. One night I was driving through the Mojave Desert on my way back from Las Vegas, and due to a miscalculation on my part, I was running dangerously low on fuel. I kept scanning the horizon desperately, hoping to spot a gas station or at least a rest area where I could park safely and wait until morning to continue my journey. But all I could see ahead was endless darkness stretching across the desert floor. After driving anxiously for several more miles, I finally noticed a red light in the distance, surrounded by bright white lights that illuminated the horizon. It appeared to be a gas station, but something about it seemed very strange. This station wasn't located alongside the highway like every other one I'd ever seen. Instead, It sat directly in the middle of the desert, and to reach it, I would have to drive across the sandy terrain. I assumed there must be some kind of access road that I hadn't noticed. But in my desperation for fuel, I decided to drive across the sand to try to reach it as quickly as possible. However, as I got closer, I noticed something unusual. There were far too many lights for a simple gas station. The place was absolutely blazing with illumination, like some kind of industrial complex or movie set. Suddenly, I was intercepted by two black SUVs that appeared out of nowhere. I couldn't identify the make or model. They looked almost military in design. Several men emerged from these vehicles and informed me that I couldn't proceed any further. I explained that I only needed some gasoline, and one of them produced a hose and a metal container. Without saying a word, he began extracting fuel from one of their SUVs and transferring it to my car. Their faces were completely expressionless, almost mask-like, as they performed this task. All I could manage to say was thank you before turning my car around and heading back toward the highway. When I reached the road and looked back, all the lights had vanished completely. It was as if the entire station had never existed. Miles later, when I stopped at a diner to grab some coffee and calm my nerves, I asked the waitress about the gas station in the desert. She looked at me like I was crazy. "Honey, there ain't no gas station out there in the middle of nowhere," she said, shaking her head. That would be the worst business decision anyone could make. Nothing but sand and rocks for 50 miles in every direction. I decided not to think too much about what had happened, though I can't help but wonder about it every time the memory resurfaces. Sometimes I question whether I actually saw anything at all, or if my mind, desperate for fuel and safety, had conjured up the entire experience. But the gas in my tank was real enough. It got me home safely that night. In 2010, my family had planned a trip to Six Flags in San Antonio. Since we were a group of about 10 people, we decided to rent a large passenger van. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until we were on our way home, traveling along a remote stretch of Highway 35 in the middle of the night. It was around midnight when the van suddenly died without any warning. My father and uncle got out to check under the hood, but they couldn't identify the problem. Since they were unable to find the source of the malfunction, we all got out to wait for someone to pass by and offer assistance. We waited for nearly 30 minutes, during which time we noticed very few vehicles traveling the highway. Finally, a pickup truck pulled over, and the driver got out to help us. He was a middle-aged man in work clothes, but his expression was grave as he approached. "It's dangerous to be stranded on this road at night," he warned us, which I didn't really understand since I was only 7 years old at the time. He helped us get the van started again. We thanked him profusely and began moving forward once more. However, just a few hundred yards down the road, the engine died again without explanation. As we were getting out to assess the situation, we suddenly heard screaming, crying, and strange metallic sounds, like heavy chains or pipes being dragged across pavement. None of us could understand what was happening, and the entire family was terrified by these horrible noises echoing through the darkness. In our fear, we all climbed back into the van and locked the doors, huddling together while the sounds continued outside. A few minutes later, a state trooper pulled up beside us. The officer approached our vehicle and spoke with my father, offering to help by attaching a heavy-duty tow rope to pull us to the nearest town. Unfortunately, the rope snapped under the weight of our large van, completely ruining that plan. The officer had to leave to respond to another call, but he assured us that someone would come to help us, since this area was known to be particularly dangerous. Echoing the words of the first man who had stopped. Now genuinely frightened and desperate, my parents decided to call my uncle, who lived relatively close to the area. When he answered the phone and heard about our location, he immediately said he would come get us, because many people disappeared on that stretch of highway. He also mentioned that this area was supposedly near where the events that inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had taken place. A couple of hours later, my uncle arrived and transported all of us to his house for the night. The strange thing was that the next morning, when my father and uncle returned to retrieve the van, it started immediately on the first try, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. I still wonder what would have happened if no one had been able to help us that night, or if we hadn't been able to reach my uncle by phone. The memory of those terrifying sounds in the darkness still gives me chills, and I've never been able to forget the warning about how dangerous that particular stretch of road was supposed to be. I worked at a gas station for several months, and during the night shift, something incredibly strange happened to me. At first, I thought it might be some kind of déjà vu, but the more I think about it, the more I realize it was something far more unsettling. It was just after midnight when a small sedan pulled up to one of the pumps. I walked over to assist the customer, but the driver got out and asked me only to clean his windshield. He then walked toward the restrooms without saying another word. I did as he requested and waited for him to return. When he came back, he handed me a surprisingly generous tip, considering I had only cleaned his windshield, got in his car, and drove away into the night. No more than 10 minutes had passed when a large black pickup truck pulled up in front of me. The driver rolled down his window and asked if I had seen a person matching a very specific description. Characteristics that perfectly matched the man I had just helped. However, something felt off about both the first customer and this truck driver, so I didn't want to get involved in whatever was going on between them. I simply told him I couldn't remember seeing anyone like that. The man thanked me and drove off, disappearing into the darkness along the highway. I thought the whole thing was curious, and I assumed that was the end of it. But I had no idea what was about to happen next. About 2 hours later, I noticed the same sedan pulling up to the exact same pump. Feeling nervous, I approached to see what the customer wanted. The driver got out, asked me to clean his windshield again, and walked toward the restrooms. I was quite confused, because all of his actions seemed to be exactly identical to what had happened earlier. When he returned, he gave me another tip, the exact same amount as before, and simply drove away. Obviously, I spent the next few minutes waiting for the pickup truck driver, who arrived just under 10 minutes later. He asked me the same questions. I gave him the same response, and he left. It seemed like some kind of very strange déjà vu, or perhaps an elaborate prank that someone was playing on me. The problem was that this pattern repeated itself a third time, then a fourth, and finally a fifth time. After that last occurrence, my shift was about to end, and my coworker was due to arrive to take over. The next day when I saw her again, she told me, without me mentioning anything about what had happened, that the men in the sedan and pickup truck had returned several more times throughout her shift, doing exactly the same thing over and over again. It was certainly unusual, something that could possibly be explained by the mental state of the individuals involved. Or maybe it was an elaborate joke, as I mentioned before. But there's always that small possibility that it was something more supernatural. A possibility that continues to disturb me to this day. My name is David, and I want to share something that happened to me during my college years. I was a sophomore at the University of Oregon, having moved there from my hometown in Northern California on a full academic scholarship. Every few weeks, I'd make the drive home to visit my parents, about a 7-hour journey through some pretty remote stretches of highway. This particular incident occurred during my very first trip back home. I was still getting used to these unfamiliar roads, with their countless exits, overpasses, and junction points leading to different destinations. This was back in 2003, before smartphones with GPS were common, so I was relying on paper maps and highway signs. I didn't realize I'd taken a wrong turn until I'd been driving for what felt like an eternity. When I finally saw a road sign indicating that the next town was somewhere I'd never heard of, and definitely not on my route home, my heart sank. To make matters worse, darkness was beginning to fall across the landscape. I turned around and started following the highway signs, trying to retrace my path back toward the interstate. But night fell faster than I anticipated, and by the time I should have been approaching the California border, I found myself even more lost than before. That's when I noticed my gas gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. Panic started to set in. I was in the middle of absolutely nowhere, no lights visible in any direction, just endless stretches of empty highway cutting through dense forest. I pressed on for another 10 or 15 minutes, desperately scanning the horizon for any sign of civilization. Then, like a mirage, I spotted lights in the distance off to the right side of the road. As I got closer, it looked like it might be a gas station. But just as hope began to flood through me, my car started to sputter and slow down. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. I was still a good half-mile from whatever those lights were. With no other choice, I grabbed my jacket and started walking. The night air was crisp and eerily quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps echoing off the asphalt. As I approached what I'd hoped would be my salvation, my heart sank once again. It was indeed a gas station, but it had clearly been abandoned for years. The building looked like it had been frozen in time from the 1980s. Faded paint peeled from the exterior walls. The old-style gas pumps stood like rusty sentinels, and weeds grew up through cracks in the concrete. The convenience store's windows were grimy and dark, though strangely, there were still a few exterior lights functioning, casting an eerie glow over the desolate scene. I sat down on a concrete ledge outside the store and pulled out my cell phone, hoping to call my parents and let them know about my situation. No signal, not even one bar. I couldn't even call for roadside assistance. I was sitting there, trying to figure out my next move, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of children's laughter coming from inside the supposedly empty building. My My first instinct was fear, but then I thought maybe there was actually someone here who could help me. Maybe a family had taken shelter in the abandoned building for the night. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there? I need help." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling silence. I approached the front door of the convenience store, which was surprisingly unlocked. Inside, the place was a disaster. Empty shelves covered in dust, trash scattered across the floor, and that musty smell of a place that had been closed up for years. Despite the exterior lights, the interior was pitch black. I called out again, "Hello. I heard children in here. I'm not here to cause trouble, I just need help." Still no response. But then I heard it again, muffled giggling, like kids trying to suppress their laughter while playing hide and seek. It seemed to be coming from the back of the store. The whole situation felt wrong. What would children be doing in this place, especially at this hour? I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard a loud crash from somewhere deeper in the building, like a heavy shelf falling over. I froze, my heart pounding. Then, in my peripheral vision, I caught sight of two small silhouettes moving past the grimy windows. They appeared to be child-sized figures, but something about their movements seemed off. They glided rather than walked, and when I blinked and looked again, they were gone. That's when pure terror took over. I ran. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached my car. I was sweating and shaking, my mind racing to process what I'd just experienced. I'd been sitting in my car for maybe 20 minutes, trying to calm down and figure out what to do next, when headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. An old pickup truck pulled up beside me, and two elderly people got out, a man and woman who looked to be in their 70s. "You all right, son?" the man asked through my partially open window. "Looks like you might be having some car trouble." I explained my situation, though I left out the part about what I'd experienced in the building. They were incredibly kind. The man happened to have a small gas can in his truck bed, enough to get me to the next town, where there was a functioning gas station, about 15 miles up the road. When I reached that gas station, I was finally able to get cell service and call my parents. I told them about getting lost and running out of gas, but I kept the strange encounter to myself. However, as I was finishing up my call outside the station, I noticed an older man standing nearby who seemed to have been listening. He approached me and said, "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation. Did you say you ran out of gas near the old abandoned station back there?" I nodded, unsure where this was going. "I'm a trucker," he continued, "been driving these routes for 30 years. I made the mistake of stopping at that place once to rest, maybe 5 years ago. Strangest thing, all night long, I heard children's voices, laughing and playing, sometimes what sounded like them banging on my truck door. But every time I looked outside, nothing, not a soul in sight." My skin began to crawl as he continued. Local folks told me the story later. Back when that station was operational, sometime in the early 90s, a semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel while pulling in for gas. Plowed right into two little kids, brother and sister, maybe 7 and 8 years old, who were walking out of the store with their parents. Killed them instantly. He paused, studying my face. "You didn't happen to see the memorial crosses behind the building, did you?" I shook my head. I hadn't stuck around long enough to notice much of anything. "Well," he said, "you probably did the right thing not staying too long. Most folks around here believe those children's spirits never moved on. They're still playing there, still trying to get people to notice them. Some say they're harmless, just lonely. Others say it's best to keep driving. I thanked him for the warning and got back on the road as quickly as possible. I never did take that route again. I found a different way to get home that added an extra hour to the trip, but kept me on major highways. To this day, I don't know what to make of what I experienced that night. Were those really the spirits of children who died tragically at that location? Or was it just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and stress? All I know is that the memory of those small silhouettes moving past those windows, and the sound of that otherworldly laughter, still gives me chills. That abandoned gas station might still be there for all I know. I've never been brave enough to find out. This happened to me back in 2004 when I was working the night shift at a gas station outside of Bakersfield, California. The station was located on a lonely stretch of Highway 99, surrounded by nothing but farmland and darkness for miles in every direction. I'd taken the job because I needed the money, and the overnight shift paid better than day work. Plus, I was used to being alone. I'd always been something of a night owl. The work was straightforward. Pump gas for customers who couldn't work the self-service pumps, stock shelves, clean, and handle the register for anyone buying snacks, drinks, or cigarettes. It was around 2:30 in the morning when everything went sideways. I was ringing up a trucker who'd stopped for coffee and beef jerky when this guy walked in. He was tall, probably 6'4", and built like he spent serious time in the gym. Maybe 35 years old, wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Nothing immediately threatening about him except for the way he moved. Too deliberate, too focused. He walked straight to the back of the store where we kept the beer coolers, like he knew exactly where he was going. The trucker finished his purchase and left, giving me a nod as he headed back to his rig. Now it was just me and this stranger. I waited for the guy to bring his beer to the counter, but instead he just stood there in the back aisle, staring at me. Not browsing, not looking at products, just staring, and smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your skin crawl, like he was enjoying some private joke at my expense. "Can I help you find something?" I called out in English, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just kept staring and smiling. Then he started walking toward me, very slowly, never breaking eye contact. As he got closer, I could see his hands more clearly in the fluorescent light. They were covered in what looked like dried blood. Dark stains on his fingers, under his nails, and splattered across his knuckles. There were similar stains on his shirt that I hadn't noticed from a distance. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I started backing away from the counter, trying to put distance between us while keeping him in sight. I made it to the front door and burst outside, heading straight for my car in the employee parking area behind the building. But when I got there, I discovered that all 4 of my tires had been slashed, deep cuts that left them completely flat. This guy had been planning this. This was before cell phones were common, so I couldn't call for help. The only phone was inside the store, and there was no way I was going back in there with him. My only hope was that another customer would show up and I could get their attention. I looked back toward the store and saw him standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright interior lights. He was still smiling, but now it was wider. He was enjoying this, the hunt, the fear, the fact that I was trapped. I ran around to the back of the building, hoping to find another way in so I could reach the phone. There was a back door, but I'd locked it myself earlier in the evening as part of our security protocol. I'd made myself a prisoner. When I came back around to the front, I discovered something that made my blood turn to ice. There was a man's body lying on the ground near the dumpster. He was naked and motionless, clearly dead. The smell hit me a second later, metallic and sickening. I spun around to see where my attacker was and realized I'd lost sight of him. He wasn't in the doorway anymore. He could be anywhere. I crept toward the front of the building, staying low and trying to see inside through the windows. The store appeared empty, but I couldn't be sure. I made a desperate decision. I had to get to that phone, even if it meant going back inside. I sprinted to the front door and threw it open, rushing inside and immediately locking it behind me. I ran to the counter where the phone was located, but when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. The line had been cut. I was trapped in this building with a killer who could be hiding anywhere, and I had no way to call for help. I grabbed a pair of scissors from behind the register, not much of a weapon, but it was all I had. Then I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the building. He was toying with me, letting me know he was out there, letting the fear build. Through the large front windows, I could see him approaching. He'd found a hunting knife somewhere, a big one with at least an 8-inch blade. He stood about 10 feet from the entrance, just far enough that I couldn't make a run for it, and began scraping the knife against the glass. The sound was horrible, a high-pitched screech that went right through me. He was grinning now, clearly enjoying the psychological torture. This wasn't his first time doing something like this. You could tell he was experienced, patient. He knew exactly how to break someone down before finishing them off. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. He'd scrape the knife, tap on the glass, or just stand there staring at me with those dead eyes. I was holding those pathetic scissors and shaking like a leaf, knowing they'd be useless against someone his size with a real weapon. Then I saw headlights turning into the station. A sedan pulled up to one of the gas pumps, and a middle-aged man got out, heading toward the store to pay for his gas. I tried to warn him, shouting and banging on the window, but it was too late. My attacker moved faster than I expected. The man from the car only had time to look confused before the knife found him. I watched in horror as another innocent person died because of this monster. He dragged the body around to the back of the building, then came back for the car, moving it next to mine and slashing those tires too. No evidence, no witnesses except me. When he returned to his position in front of the store, his smile was bigger than ever. He just killed 2 people, and it seemed to energize him rather than satisfy him. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just wait there for him to find a way inside. So I made a plan. I'd go out the back door, circle around through the darkness, and try to run to the highway where I might flag down a passing car. I grabbed the scissors and headed for the back of the store. I unlocked the door as quietly as possible and slipped outside into the night. The air was still and cold. I could hear my own heartbeat as I started moving along the back wall of the building, trying to stay in the shadows. I made it about halfway to the corner when I heard footsteps running behind me. He'd figured out what I was doing. I ran as hard as I could toward the highway, which was probably 200 yards away through an open field. I could hear him gaining on me. His legs were longer, and he was in better shape. Just as I was certain he was about to catch me, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life, red and blue flashing lights in the distance, getting closer fast. Somehow the police were coming. I heard the footsteps behind me stop, then fade away as he retreated back toward the trees. I kept running toward the lights, waving my arms and shouting until the patrol car saw me and pulled over. The officers, 2 deputies from the county sheriff's department, listened to my story and immediately called for backup. When we got back to the gas station, the killer was gone, but the evidence of what he'd done was all there. 2 bodies, slashed tires, the cut phone line. During the investigation, they showed me a photograph and asked if this was the man who terrorized me. It was definitely him. Turned out he was an escaped patient from a state mental hospital about 50 miles away. He'd been there for 8 years after being found not guilty by reason of insanity for a previous murder. The hospital had been searching for him for 3 days. I learned later that he enjoyed hunting people. It wasn't about robbery or passion, it was sport to him. He'd done this before, and if I hadn't been lucky enough for those deputies to show up when they did, he would have done it again. They caught him 2 days later, hiding in an abandoned barn. He's been in maximum security ever since, and I hope he never sees the outside of a prison cell again. I quit that job immediately and didn't work another night shift for years. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that knife scraping against glass. Some experiences mark you forever, and this was definitely one of them. The thing that still bothers me most is how close it came. If those deputies had been 5 minutes later, or if they'd been patrolling a different area that night, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes survival comes down to nothing more than luck and timing. This happened about 2 years ago when I was working as a night cashier at a gas station in Fresno, California. My coworker Sarah and I had the overnight shift, and while it could get pretty quiet during the late hours, we never felt unsafe since we were in the city limits, and there was usually a steady stream of customers throughout the night. I remember that particular evening clearly because of what had happened the day before. Our manager had called both Sarah and me around 6 in the evening to tell us that our location would be closed that night due to a violent incident. A prominent local businessman had been shot and killed while filling up his car that afternoon. Someone had apparently targeted him specifically, waiting for him to stop for gas before opening fire. The story was all over the local news because the victim was well known in the community. He owned several successful restaurants and was involved in a lot of charity work. His photo was everywhere on TV and social media. The police had cordoned off the entire gas station to process the crime scene, so there was no way we could open for business. The next evening, our manager called again to let us know that the investigation was complete and we could resume normal operations. I arrived at 9 o'clock for my shift, and Sarah was already there, having worked the evening hours. We spent some time talking about what had happened. Sarah mentioned that she'd only found out about the shooting from our manager's call, since she didn't really follow the news and had no idea who the victim was. She seemed nervous about the possibility of something similar happening during our shift, but I assured her that it was probably a targeted attack and unlikely to affect us. The night started off slower than usual. I guess people were still uneasy about coming to our location after what had happened. Around 11:30, I went to the back office to call my wife and let her know everything was okay, since she'd been worried about me working there after hearing about the shooting. I was only gone for about 3 or 4 minutes, but when I came back to the front counter, Sarah was standing at the window looking out into the parking lot with a puzzled expression. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Who are you looking for?" She turned to me with this strange look on her face. The weirdest thing just happened. This man came in a few minutes ago. He was only wearing one shoe, and his shirt had holes in it like he'd been in some kind of accident. He didn't say anything to me, just walked to the back aisle and stood there staring out the window for the longest time. "Did he buy anything?" I asked. No, that's what was so strange. He just stared outside with this really sad expression, and then suddenly he turned around and left. I was trying to see where he went, but I lost sight of him. There's no car out there, so I don't know how he got here or where he went. Sarah seemed genuinely unsettled by the encounter. She described the man as being well-dressed despite the torn shirt and missing shoe, like someone who'd been in a car accident, but had been wearing nice clothes when it happened. For some reason, her description made me think of the businessman who'd been killed the day before. I pulled out my phone and found one of the news articles with his photo. "Sarah," I said, holding up the phone, "was this the guy who came in?" When she looked at the screen, her face went completely white. Above the man's photo was the headline about his murder. She stared at it for several seconds, her mouth slightly open in shock. "That's him," she whispered. "That's definitely him. But how is that possible? The article says he..." She couldn't finish the sentence. I have to admit, if I hadn't seen Sarah's reaction myself, I never would have believed it. But the look of genuine terror on her face was unmistakable. This wasn't someone trying to pull a prank or get attention. She was truly frightened by what she'd experienced. We didn't have access to the security camera footage. Only our manager could review that, so there was no way for us to verify what had happened. But Sarah's hands were shaking for the rest of our shift. She kept looking toward the back of the store like she expected him to appear again. The next day, she put in a request to be transferred to the day shift at another location. When that was denied, she quit the job entirely. I never saw her again after that night. I wasn't the one who saw this apparition, but I was there when Sarah identified the photo. The look in her eyes was something I'll never forget. Pure, absolute terror mixed with confusion and disbelief. There's no way she was making it up. The more I think about it, the more it makes sense in a tragic way. When someone dies suddenly and violently, especially in a place they never expected to be in danger, maybe their spirit gets confused. Maybe they don't immediately understand what's happened to them. Maybe they return to the last place they remember being alive, trying to make sense of their situation. I worked at that gas station for another 6 months after Sarah left, and I never experienced anything unusual myself. But I always wondered if that man's spirit was still coming around, still trying to understand why his life had ended so abruptly in such an ordinary place. It's sad to think about, really. Here was someone who'd spent his life building businesses and helping his community, and in the end, He might have been trapped in the place where it all came to a violent end, unable to move on. I hope that wherever he is now, he's found peace. And I hope Sarah has been able to forget what she saw that night, though something tells me that's the kind of experience that stays with you forever. This happened during a family trip we took to Disneyland back in 2007. My wife and I were driving down from Sacramento with our 2 kids. They were 8 and 10 at the time, and we'd left later in the day than planned. By the time we hit the stretch of Highway 5 through the Central Valley, it was already getting dark. I noticed we were running low on gas, so I started looking for a station. In that part of California, especially at night, your options can be pretty limited. When I finally saw the lights of a gas station off the highway, I didn't hesitate to pull in, even though the place looked like it had seen better days. It was one of those older stations with the pumps that require you to pay inside first, not the modern pay-at-the-pump setup we were used to. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, with that typical fluorescent lighting that makes everything look harsh and unwelcoming. I walked into the convenience store to prepay for the gas, and at first glance, the place appeared to be empty. The shelves were stocked, the lights were on, but I didn't see anyone behind the counter. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone here?" That's when I saw her. A young woman, probably in her mid-20s, suddenly appeared behind the register. I say appeared because I honestly don't know where she came from. One second the area behind the counter was empty, and the next second she was standing there, smiling at me. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and was wearing what looked like the store's uniform, a blue polo shirt with the gas station's logo. She seemed friendly enough, though there was something oddly distant about her expression, like she was looking at me but not really seeing me. I told her I wanted to fill up my tank and handed her my credit card. She processed the transaction without saying a word, not hello, not how much gas, nothing. She just smiled pleasantly and handed me the receipt. "Thanks," I said, but she didn't respond, just kept smiling. I went back outside to pump the gas, but when I inserted the nozzle and tried to start the flow, nothing happened. The pump wasn't activated. I checked the display screen, and it was showing that I needed to go back inside to have it authorized, thinking maybe the cashier had made a mistake or forgotten to activate the pump. I went back into the store, but now it was empty again. No one behind the counter, no one anywhere that I could see. I waited a minute, thinking maybe she'd gone to the restroom or was in the back getting something. Then I heard a toilet flush from the back of the store, and a young guy emerged from what was apparently an employee bathroom. He looked surprised to see me. "Oh hey, sorry about that," he said. "I didn't hear you come in. How long have you been waiting?" "Not long," I replied. "But actually, your coworker already helped me. I paid for gas, but she forgot to activate the pump. I just need her to turn it on." The guy looked confused. "Coworker, I'm the only one working tonight. There's nobody else here." I thought he was joking at first. "Come on, man." The woman who was just at the register, dark hair, blue polo shirt. "She took my payment like 5 minutes ago." But his expression remained serious, and now he looked a little concerned. "Sir, I promise you, I'm working alone tonight. There's no woman employee on this shift. Can you show me your receipt?" I handed him the receipt from my credit card transaction, and his face went pale as he looked at it. "This is impossible," he said quietly. "This shows a sale, but I didn't process any transactions in the last hour. And look at the timestamp. It shows a sale happening right now, but I was in the bathroom." He stared at the receipt for another few seconds, then looked up at me with an expression I'll never forget, part confusion, part fear. Sir, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, but I think you might have encountered someone who isn't supposed to be here anymore. What do you mean? I asked, though I was starting to get an uneasy feeling. About 3 years ago, we had an employee named Jennifer who was killed in a hit-and-run accident. She was leaving work late one night, walking to her car in the parking lot, when someone hit her and kept driving. They never caught the person who did it. He paused, seeming to gather his courage to continue. Other employees have reported seeing her from time to time. Always the same thing: she appears behind the register, processes a transaction, then disappears. The sales show up in our system, but there's never any record of who handled them. Management knows about it, but what are they supposed to do? Call in an exorcist? I felt chills running down my spine. Are you telling me I just bought gas from a ghost? I don't know what else to call it, he said, but I can activate your pump now so you can get your gas. And sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention this to too many people. We already have enough trouble keeping employees willing to work the night shift. He activated the pump, and I went back outside to fill up my tank. My hands were shaking slightly as I pumped the gas. I kept looking back at the store, half expecting to see the woman in the window, but I didn't see her again. When I got back in the car, my wife immediately noticed something was wrong. What took so long? You look like you've seen a ghost. The kids were asleep in the back seat, so I quietly told her what had happened. She stared at me in disbelief. Are you sure you didn't just miss seeing the guy when you first went in? I'm positive, I said. She was standing right there at the register. She took my card, processed the payment, handed me the receipt. I looked right at her face. We drove the rest of the way to our hotel in relative silence, both of us trying to process what had happened. It wasn't until we were checking in that I really started to question my own memory. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I more tired from driving than I'd realized? But then I looked at the receipt again. There it was, a transaction processed at exactly the time I said it happened, by someone who, according to the night clerk, shouldn't have existed. I've told this story to a few close friends over the years, and I can see in their eyes that they think I'm either lying or delusional. But I know what I experienced. I had a full conversation, or at least a transaction, with someone who died 3 years earlier. The thing that bothers me most is how normal she seemed. She wasn't scary or threatening or obviously supernatural. She just looked like any other young woman working a late shift at a gas station. If the pump hadn't malfunctioned, I never would have gone back inside, and I never would have known what I'd encountered. It makes me wonder how many times we interact with people who aren't really there anymore. But we just don't realize it, because everything seems perfectly ordinary in the moment. My name is Marcus, and this happened when I was 22 years old, working the night shift at a gas station in a small town called Millfield, about 45 minutes outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I'd always been a night person, so the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift suited me perfectly. The pay was decent, and I liked the quiet atmosphere of the desert town after dark. The gas station was located right at the town's main entrance, where Highway 60 met the local roads. Most of my customers were locals I'd gotten to know over the few months I'd been working there, along with the occasional long-haul trucker passing through. It was a friendly little community, and I'd grown quite attached to the place and its people. This particular night started like any other. I'd arrived at 10 o'clock and was restocking the soda coolers with cases that had been delivered that afternoon. The store was quiet, with just the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Around 11:30, while I was loading cans of Coke into the cooler, I heard footsteps coming from the storage room at the back of the store. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was walking around back there. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. The footsteps had stopped, but I was sure I'd heard them. I figured maybe my manager had forgotten to mention that someone would be coming in to do inventory or maintenance work. I went back to stocking the cooler, but a few minutes later, I heard the footsteps again, this time accompanied by what sounded like children giggling. That was definitely odd. What would kids be doing in our storage room in the middle of the night? I walked to the back of the store and opened the storage room door, flipping on the light switch. The room was empty, just shelves of supplies, boxes of merchandise, and cleaning equipment. I looked around carefully, checking behind the larger boxes, but there was no one there. I returned to my work, but I'd barely gotten back to the cooler when I heard a loud bang from the storage room. Like someone had slammed their fist against the door from the inside. This was getting ridiculous. I walked back to the storage area and called out, "Hello? Is someone back here? This is private property. You need to come out now or I'm calling the police." No response. But then I heard it again, children's laughter, definitely coming from inside that room. It sounded like two kids, maybe around 7 or 8 years old, trying to stifle their giggles like they were playing hide and seek. Just as I was about to open the door again to investigate, Mrs. Henderson came into the store. She was one of my regular customers, a widow in her 60s who lived nearby, and often stopped in for milk or bread on her way home from her evening job at the diner. She noticed me standing frozen in the hallway, probably looking confused and a little spooked. "Everything all right, Marcus?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I turned to her and explained what I'd been hearing. Instead of looking surprised, her expression grew serious and somewhat sad. "Oh, honey," she said, "I was wondering when this would happen. I've been expecting someone to tell me about hearing things in this place eventually." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mrs. Henderson set down her purse and looked at me with compassionate eyes. "Marcus, this building has a very sad history. What you're experiencing, well, you're not the first employee to notice it, and you probably won't be the last." She went on to explain that the gas station had been built on the site of what used to be a large Victorian house. Back in 1987, the house had belonged to the town's mayor, a man named Robert Caldwell, who lived there with his wife Margaret and their 7-year-old twins, Emma and Joshua. Margaret Caldwell had been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia and had been receiving treatment from a psychiatrist in Phoenix. She'd been managing her condition with medication and regular therapy sessions, but her husband had refused to consider having her hospitalized, believing he could care for her at home. One night in late October, while Mayor Caldwell was attending a conference in Tucson, Margaret had what doctors would later describe as a complete psychotic break. In her delusional state, she believed that her children were in danger from some imaginary threat, and that the only way to protect them was to prevent them from falling into the hands of their supposed enemies. When Robert returned home the next morning, he found the horrific scene. Margaret had taken the lives of both children during the night and was found in a catatonic state in the living room. Due to her mental illness, she was committed to a state psychiatric facility rather than being sent to prison. The house stood empty for years after that. No one in the small town wanted to live there, despite its size and beauty. Eventually, A developer from out of state bought the property, demolished the house, and built this gas station in the early 90s. The thing is, Mrs. Henderson continued, you're not the only employee who's heard children playing in that back room. Over the years, several night shift workers have reported the same thing: footsteps, laughter, sometimes the sound of kids whispering to each other. Most of them quit within a few weeks. But you've never actually seen anything yourself? I asked. No, but I believe every word of what people have told me. Emma and Joshua were such sweet children. I used to see them playing in the yard when I'd drive past their house. It breaks my heart to think their spirits might still be here, unable to move on. Mrs. Henderson bought her milk and bread and gave me some advice before leaving. She told me to carry a small cross or some other religious item with me, and if I heard the children again, to speak to them kindly and ask them to find peace. She also gave me her phone number and told me to call if I ever felt unsafe. After she left, I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd told me. The idea that I was hearing the spirits of murdered children was both heartbreaking and terrifying. Around 3 a.m, it happened again. This time, the footsteps in the storage room were louder and more persistent. Then came 3 sharp knocks on the door, like someone was trying to get my attention. I walked slowly to the back of the store, my heart pounding. When I reached the storage room door, I could hear what sounded like whispering on the other side, 2 young voices having a quiet conversation that I couldn't quite make out. Taking Mrs. Henderson's advice, I spoke to the door gently. Emma, Joshua, if that's you in there, I want you to know that you're safe now. No one can hurt you anymore. It's okay to let go and find peace. The whispering stopped immediately, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The door handle started turning from the inside, very slowly, like a child was trying to open it. I backed away from the door, watching as the handle completed a full turn. The door creaked open about 6 inches, then stopped. Through the gap, I could see into the storage room, but it was completely dark despite the light switch being on the wall just inside the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that partially open door. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond, I heard a small voice, definitely a child's voice, whisper, "Thank you." The door slowly swung shut on its own, and I heard the soft click of the latch engaging. After that, the building was completely silent for the rest of my shift. When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I told him I needed to step outside for some fresh air. The morning sun felt wonderful on my face after what I'd experienced, but I was emotionally drained. I worked at that gas station for another 3 months, and I never heard the children again. Other employees mentioned occasional odd sounds or feelings of being watched, but nothing like what I'd experienced that night. I like to think that Emma and Joshua finally found the peace they deserved. Maybe all they needed was for someone to acknowledge their presence and tell them it was okay to let go of this world. Mrs. Henderson later told me that she believed the children's spirits had been trapped there because of the traumatic and sudden way they died, unable to understand what had happened to them. She thought that by speaking to them with kindness and giving them permission to move on, I'd help them find their way to wherever children's souls go when they're ready to leave this world behind. I still drive through Millfield sometimes when I'm in that part of Arizona, and I always stop at that gas station to buy something, just to check in. It's been years now, and no one has reported any unusual activity. I hope that means Emma and Joshua are finally at peace, playing somewhere safe where no harm can ever come to them again. My name is Carlos, and I'm from El Paso, Texas. This happened to me in 2015 while I was driving back to my hometown from Albuquerque, where I'd been working a construction job for the past few months. I made this drive every couple of weeks to visit my family, and I always took the same route, mostly interstate highways, that cut through some pretty desolate stretches of New Mexico desert. It was around 4 in the morning, and I was getting close to the Texas border when I realized I desperately needed to use a restroom. I'd been drinking coffee to stay alert during the drive, and it was finally catching up with me. The problem was, this particular stretch of highway was pretty remote, nothing but empty desert and mountains as far as you could see. I drove for another 10 or 15 minutes, getting increasingly uncomfortable, until I finally saw the lights of what appeared to be a truck stop up ahead. It wasn't much to look at, just a small gas station with a convenience store and a couple of big rig parking spaces. But it was exactly what I needed. I parked near the building and hurried inside to ask the clerk where the restroom was located. He was a young guy, maybe in his early 20s, and he pointed toward the side of the building. "It's around the corner," he said. "Just one bathroom, but it should be empty right now." I thanked him and headed outside. The restroom was indeed around the corner from the main entrance, set back slightly toward a cluster of scraggly desert trees. It was one of those standalone bathroom facilities you sometimes see at older truck stops, just a single room with a heavy metal door. When I reached the door and tried the handle, it was locked. I knocked gently and called out, "Excuse me, is someone in there?" A man's voice answered immediately, "Don't come in." The tone was strange, not angry or rushed like you'd expect from someone who was using the facilities, but more like a warning. There was something urgent about it, almost fearful. "No problem," I called back. "Just let me know when you're finished." I figured the guy was probably a trucker who'd stopped for a break and maybe wasn't feeling well. I'd give him some privacy and wait a few minutes. I walked back toward the front of the building and leaned against my truck, checking my phone and looking up at the stars. The desert sky was absolutely clear that night, with more stars visible than you ever see in the city. After about 5 minutes, I started to get impatient. I really couldn't wait much longer. I walked back to the bathroom door and knocked again. "Hey, I'm really sorry to bother you, but I'm kind of in an emergency situation here. How much longer do you think you'll need?" The same voice answered with the same odd tone, "Don't come in." That's when I started to find the situation strange. Why would someone just sit in a public restroom for 10 minutes without coming out? And why did he keep saying "don't come in" instead of just a minute, or almost finished, like a normal person would? I looked around the parking area and realized something I hadn't noticed before. There were no other vehicles around except for my truck. No cars, no big rigs, nothing. If someone was in that bathroom, how had they gotten there? Confused and getting more concerned by the minute, I went back into the convenience store to ask the clerk about it. "Hey," I said, "I've been waiting to use the restroom for about 10 minutes now. There's a guy in there, but I don't see his vehicle anywhere. Did you see him come in?" The clerk looked puzzled. "Sir, you're the only customer I've seen in the last 2 hours. I haven't seen anyone else around here tonight." "But there's definitely someone in the bathroom," I insisted. "I've talked to him twice. He keeps telling me not to come in." The young man's expression changed from confusion to something that looked like recognition, followed quickly by concern. "Sir, this might sound crazy, but that bathroom has been locked from the inside for the past 3 days. We've been trying to figure out how to get it open, but the lock mechanism seems to be jammed somehow." "What do you mean locked for 3 days?" "I just heard someone talking in there. He came out from behind the counter and walked with me back to the bathroom. When we got there, he knocked on the door himself. 'Hello, is someone in there? We need to get this door opened.' We both heard the voice respond clearly, 'Don't come in.' The clerk went pale. He stared at the door for a few seconds, then looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. 'Sir, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to believe it. 3 years ago, we had an incident here. A man was found dead in that bathroom. He'd been murdered and left there. It took us a whole day to find the body because customers kept saying the bathroom was occupied, but no one ever saw anyone come or go. I felt chills run down my spine. 'Are you saying what I think you're saying?' 'I don't know what I'm saying,' he replied. 'All I know is that sometimes people report hearing a voice from that bathroom, always saying the same thing. Don't come in.' We've had locksmiths out here, maintenance crews, even called the police once. Every time they manage to get the door open, there's nothing inside. But then it locks again somehow, and the voice comes back." He explained that the murder victim had been a traveling salesman who'd stopped here late one night, just like I had. Someone had followed him into the bathroom and killed him. The police never caught who did it. Man had been discovered sitting on the floor with his back against the door, like he'd been trying to keep someone out. "Maybe," the clerk said quietly, "he's still trying to protect people. Maybe he doesn't want anyone else to go through what he went through." I didn't know what to say to that. The whole situation was beyond anything I'd ever experienced or even believed possible. "Is there anywhere else I can?" I asked. "There's a McDonald's about 20 miles down the highway," he said. "Really sorry about this. Most people just drive away when they hear the voice." I thanked him and got back in my truck, but before I left, I walked back to the bathroom door one more time. I stood there for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I don't know if you can hear me or understand me, but thank you for the warning. I hope you find peace." I didn't hear a response, but as I walked away, I could have sworn I heard the sound of a door lock clicking open. I never stopped at that truck stop again. I always made sure to plan my trips so I could use facilities at larger, busier locations. But sometimes, when I'm driving through that area late at night, I think about that voice and wonder if that man's spirit is still there, still trying to protect people from whatever danger he once faced. The clerk was right about one thing. I'll never forget hearing that voice. It wasn't angry or threatening. If anything, it sounded sad and worried, like someone who was genuinely trying to help. Maybe death doesn't always end our desire to protect others. Maybe sometimes love and concern are stronger than whatever separates the living from the dead. This happened when I was working the night shift at a gas station on Interstate 80 in Nebraska, about halfway between Lincoln and Omaha. It was a pretty remote location, just us, a 24-hour diner across the highway, and miles of cornfields in every direction. I'd been working there for about 6 months, and had gotten used to the solitude and the steady stream of long-haul truckers who'd stop for fuel, coffee, and bathroom breaks during their cross-country runs. Always been the kind of person who wasn't afraid of much. Working alone in the middle of nowhere never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it to dealing with crowds and city traffic. The pay was good for what it was, and I genuinely enjoyed the quiet nights and the interesting conversations I'd have with the truckers who'd stop by. This particular night was like any other. I just finished helping a couple of customers and was straightening up some merchandise behind the counter when a man walked in. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, typical trucker attire. But something about his appearance struck me as odd. His clothes looked dirty, like he'd been wearing them for days, and his hair was disheveled. He had a somewhat desperate expression on his face, He approached the counter and without any greeting asked, "Could you give me change for a 20? I need quarters to use the payphone. I have to call my family, it's urgent." This was back in 2008 when payphones were already becoming pretty rare, but we did have one outside the building that still worked. I looked in the cash register, but we'd been busy that evening and I was running low on quarters. "I'm sorry," I told him, "but I don't have very many quarters right now. Maybe $8 or $10 worth. Would that be enough?" He looked distressed. "I really need to call home. My wife will be worried sick. Please, isn't there anything you can do?" I felt bad for the guy. He seemed genuinely upset about not being able to reach his family. I decided to help him out with my own money. "Hold on," I said. "Let me check my pocket for some quarters." I reached into my jeans and pulled out the change. I had probably about $3 in quarters that I'd gotten earlier when I bought a soda from the vending machine. "Here," I said, "take these. Don't worry about paying me back." But when I looked up to hand him the quarters, he was gone. Just completely vanished. I looked around the store, thinking maybe he'd wandered off to browse while I was getting the change, but he was nowhere to be seen. I walked outside to see if he'd gone to his truck or was already at the payphone, but the parking lot was empty except for one semi-truck that belonged to a driver who was inside the diner across the highway. There was no sign of the man anywhere. It was strange, but I figured maybe he'd been in a hurry and had left to find change somewhere else. I went back inside and continued with my work, though I kept thinking about how oddly he'd disappeared. A few days later, I was talking with my coworker Jenny, who worked the evening shift before mine. I mentioned the incident, mostly just as an amusing story about a customer who'd vanished into thin air. Jenny's reaction was not what I expected. Her face went white, and she stared at me with a mixture of surprise and something that looked like fear. "You saw him too?" she asked. "What do you mean, too?" "The trucker who asks for quarters to call his family. Other people have seen him. Michael, who worked here before you, told me about the exact same thing happening to him several times. A middle-aged trucker, dirty clothes, desperate to call his family, then just disappears when you try to help him." Jenny went on to explain that this had been reported by at least 3 different employees over the past couple of years. Always the same story, a distressed trucker needing change for the payphone, then vanishing without a trace. "Did Michael ever find out who he was?" I asked. "That's the scary part," Jenny said. "Michael got curious about it and started looking into local accident reports. He found something from 4 years ago. A trucker named Frank Morrison had an accident on this stretch of highway about 2 miles from here. Fell asleep at the wheel around 3 in the morning and jackknifed into the median. Died on impact." She pulled out her phone and showed me a news article she'd saved. There was a photo of the victim, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and a kind face. He looked familiar, but I couldn't be completely sure it was the same person I'd encountered. According to the article, Jenny continued, he was on his way home to Iowa after a long haul from California. He'd been driving for 14 hours straight, trying to get home for his daughter's birthday. His wife told reporters that he'd promised to call when he was getting close to home, but she never heard from him. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd encountered the spirit of Frank Morrison. The desperate need to contact his family, the disheveled appearance, the way he'd simply vanished, it all made a tragic kind of sense. Over the next few months, I heard from other employees that customers had reported similar encounters. Always the same story, a trucker asking for change to call his family, then disappearing before he could be helped. Some people reported seeing him near the payphone, looking confused and frustrated, like he couldn't figure out how to make it work. I started doing some research of my own and found more details about Frank Morrison's life. He'd been a truck driver for 23 years, had 2 kids, and a wife he was devoted to. His family described him as someone who always kept his promises and never failed to check in when he was on the road. The accident report indicated that he'd probably been dead before emergency responders arrived on the scene. He never got the chance to make that final call home to let his family know he was almost there. I like to think that Frank is still trying to fulfill that last promise to his wife, still attempting to let his family know that he was thinking of them right up until the end. Maybe some promises are so important that they transcend death itself. I worked at that gas station for another 1.5 years, and I saw Frank Morrison 2 more times. Each encounter was almost identical, the same request for quarters, the same desperate need to call home, the same mysterious disappearance. I always tried to help him, even though I knew by then that he'd vanish before I could give him the change. I don't know if Frank will ever find peace, or if he'll keep trying to make that phone call for eternity. But I hope that somewhere, somehow, his family knows that he never stopped trying to come home to them. This happened during a family road trip we took in the summer of 2009. My ex-wife Karen and I were driving from our home in Dallas to visit my mother-in-law in Denver, who had recently moved there after getting remarried. Our daughter Emma was 6 years old at the time, and this was going to be her first time meeting her new step-grandfather. We'd left Dallas in the late afternoon, planning to drive straight through the night to avoid the worst of the summer heat. Emma was excited about the trip, but by the time we'd been driving for about 4 hours, she announced that she needed to use the bathroom. We were on a pretty remote stretch of Highway 87 in the Texas Panhandle, where towns are few and far between. It was already getting dark, and we hadn't seen a gas station or restaurant for at least 30 miles. I was starting to worry that we'd have to make an emergency stop on the side of the road when Karen spotted lights in the distance. "There," she said, pointing ahead. "Looks like there might be something up there." I had to turn off the main highway onto a dirt access road to reach what turned out to be a small roadside rest area. It wasn't much, just a small building with restrooms, a few picnic tables, and a couple of those old-fashioned water pumps you sometimes see at state parks. The place looked like it had been built in the 60s or 70s and hadn't been updated much since. The building was dark except for a couple of security lights that illuminated the entrance to the restrooms. There were no other cars in the small parking area, which wasn't surprising given how remote the location was. I parked as close to the building as possible and waited in the car, while Karen took Emma to the women's restroom. They'd been gone for about 5 minutes when I heard Emma scream, not a playful scream, but a genuine cry of fear and pain. I jumped out of the car and ran toward the restroom building. Karen was already coming out, carrying Emma, who was crying and obviously terrified. "We need to leave," Karen said urgently. "Right now." She was pale and shaking, and Emma was clinging to her neck, sobbing. I could see what looked like finger marks on Emma's upper arm, red marks like someone had grabbed her forcefully. "What happened?" I asked, but Karen just shook her head and headed toward the car. "I'll tell you when we're back on the highway," she said. "Just drive." I didn't argue. Whatever had happened had clearly scared them both badly. I got us back onto the main highway as quickly as possible, and we drove for another 20 minutes before Karen was calm enough to explain what had occurred. According to Karen, when they'd entered the restroom building, there were 2 stalls. One appeared to be occupied. She could see someone's feet under the door, so Emma used the available stall while Karen waited outside. Emma had finished and come out to wash her hands at the sink when the occupied stall door suddenly opened. An elderly woman emerged, someone Karen described as looking to be in her 70s or 80s, with long gray hair and wearing what appeared to be a nightgown or hospital gown. The woman had looked directly at Emma with what Karen described as the most malevolent expression I've ever seen on a human face. Without warning, she'd reached out and grabbed Emma's arm with surprising strength, trying to pull her toward the back of the restroom, where there was a door that presumably led outside. Emma had screamed and tried to pull away, which is when Karen had rushed over and managed to get between them. But when she turned to confront the woman and demand an explanation, the elderly lady had simply vanished. 1 second she was there, the next second she was gone. Gone how? I asked. Did she run outside? It's the thing, Karen said. I immediately checked the back door, but it was locked from the inside. There's no way she could have gotten out that way. And she wasn't in either of the stalls. I checked them both. She just disappeared. Emma was still crying in the back seat, but she was starting to calm down enough to talk. The scary lady had long fingernails, she said between sobs. She hurt my arm and tried to take me outside. She had a really mean face. Did you see where she went, sweetheart? I asked. She went back into the bathroom when Mommy came to help me, Emma said. But then Mommy looked, and she wasn't there anymore. The whole situation was deeply unsettling. The physical evidence was right there on Emma's arm, 5 distinct finger marks where someone had gripped her forcefully. But according to Karen, there was no way for the woman to have left that restroom without being seen. We drove straight through to Denver without making any more stops, except for gas at well-lit stations in populated areas. Emma seemed to recover from the immediate trauma pretty quickly, the way kids often do, but she talked about the incident for weeks afterward. The mean lady wanted to take me to the woods, she'd say. She had really long, scary nails, and she smelled bad. Karen and I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Karen had been more flustered than she'd realized, and had missed seeing the woman leave. Maybe there was another exit we hadn't noticed. But every explanation felt inadequate when we looked at those finger marks on Emma's arm years later. When Emma was in high school, she brought up the incident during a family discussion about strange experiences. Her memory of it was still remarkably clear and detailed. I remember exactly what she looked like, Emma said. She was really old and her hair was all messy, but the scariest thing was her eyes. They were so angry, like she hated me for some reason. And when she grabbed me, her hands were freezing cold, even though it was summer. Emma also mentioned something she'd never told us at the time, that the woman had whispered something to her when she'd grabbed her arm. She said, "Come with me, little girl. Come play with me forever." That's why I screamed so loud. I knew she wanted to hurt me. I've driven past that rest area several times over the years when traveling that route, but I've never stopped there again. From the highway, it looks abandoned now. The building appears to be boarded up, and the parking area is overgrown with weeds. I don't know who or what that elderly woman was, but I'm convinced she had malevolent intentions toward our daughter. The fact that she vanished without a trace suggests she wasn't entirely human, but the physical evidence of her presence was undeniable. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Karen hadn't been right there when the woman grabbed Emma. The thought of our 6-year-old daughter being dragged out into those dark woods by some malevolent spirit is something that still gives me nightmares. I'm just grateful that whatever protective instincts kicked in for Karen that night were enough to save our daughter from whatever that entity had planned for her. My name is Ricardo, and I'm originally from Caracas, Venezuela, though I've been living in the United States for over 20 years now. This incident happened in 2006 when I was driving from Houston to San Antonio for a job interview. A friend had recommended me for a position with a construction company there, and even though it meant a 5-hour drive each way, the pay was significantly better than what I was making at the time. I decided to drive through the night to arrive early for my morning interview, so I left my apartment around 1 a.m. The drive was mostly on Interstate 10, a route I'd taken many times before, but I'd never made the trip in the middle of the night. Around 3 in the morning, somewhere between Katy and Columbus, I realized I needed to stop for a bathroom break. I'd been drinking coffee to stay alert, and it was finally catching up with me. The highway was pretty desolate at that hour, just the occasional truck or late-night traveler. When I saw the lights of a gas station ahead, I decided to pull over. It was one of those smaller, older stations you sometimes find on rural stretches of highway, not part of a major chain, just a local business trying to serve travelers and truckers. As I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately noticed something that didn't feel right. There were 2 men inside the store, visible through the large front windows, and their body language suggested some kind of confrontation or tense situation. One was behind the counter, wearing what looked like an employee uniform, and the other was standing in front of the register with a large backpack. My first instinct was to keep driving and find another place to stop, but my need for a bathroom was becoming urgent. I decided to go in quickly, use the restroom, and leave without getting involved in whatever was happening. When I entered the store, I asked the man behind the counter where the bathroom was located. He seemed nervous and kept glancing at the other man, but he directed me to the back of the store. I hurried to the restroom, used it as quickly as possible, and prepared to leave. But as I was walking back toward the front of the store, something felt very wrong. Both men were staring at me with expressions that made my skin crawl. There was an intensity in their eyes that suggested I'd walked into something dangerous. I didn't even pause to acknowledge them. I just headed straight for the door. But as I was getting into my car, a young woman in a gas station uniform came running out of the building. "Please call 911, she shouted through the rain that had started falling. "Please help." The lighting was poor and the weather made it hard to see clearly, but I could tell she was genuinely distressed. I immediately grabbed my cell phone and dialed emergency services, giving them the location and explaining that someone at the gas station was requesting help. When I looked back toward the building to get more information from the woman, she was gone. I looked all around the parking lot, but I couldn't see her anywhere. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. The 911 operator was asking me for more details, but I had to admit I didn't really know what the emergency was. I described what I'd seen and mentioned that an employee had asked me to call for help, but I couldn't provide much more information than that. I waited in my car for a few minutes to see if the woman would reappear, but she didn't. Eventually, I decided to continue with my trip, figuring that the police would sort out whatever was happening when they arrived. The next morning, after my job interview, I was having breakfast at a diner in San Antonio when I saw the news report on the restaurant's television. The story was about a robbery and murder that had taken place at a gas station on Interstate 10, the same station where I'd stopped. According to the news, the night clerk, a young woman named Jessica Martinez, had been killed during what appeared to be an inside job. One of her coworkers had conspired with a friend to rob the station. But when Jessica discovered what was happening, they'd killed her to keep her quiet. When they showed Jessica's photo on the news, I recognized her immediately. She had distinctive red hair that I remembered noticing when she'd run out of the building asking for help. But according to the police report, the coroner had determined that she died at approximately 3 a.m. I had passed by that gas station at 4 a.m., and Jessica had asked me to call for help at 4:15. This realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd received a plea for help from someone who was already dead, and I'd been too confused and scared to understand what was really happening. I called the police department handling the case and offered to give a statement about what I'd witnessed. During the interview, I told them about the 2 suspicious men I'd seen in the store and about Jessica asking me to call 911. However, I struggled with how to explain the timing discrepancy, how I'd interacted with her after her estimated time of death. Fortunately, there were security cameras in the parking lot that corroborated my presence at the scene and showed me making the phone call. This helped establish a timeline for the investigation and provided evidence that supported the police theory about it being an inside job. Both perpetrators were eventually arrested and convicted. Jessica's coworker received a life sentence, and his accomplice got 25 years. Justice was served, but it didn't change the fact that a young woman had died just for doing her job and trying to protect her employer's business. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization that Jessica appeared to me after her death, still trying to get help, still hoping that someone could save her or at least bring her killers to justice. Her spirit reached out to the one person who had witnessed the scene, asking for the help she desperately needed. I like to think that my phone call, even though it came too late to save Jessica's life, helped ensure that her murderers were caught and punished. Maybe that's what she needed, not to be rescued, but to know that someone would make sure her death wasn't ignored or forgotten. It took me a long time to process what had happened that night. I'd never believed in ghosts or supernatural experiences before, but there was no rational explanation for what I'd witnessed. Jessica Martinez appeared to me in her final moment of hope, trusting that a complete stranger would help her get justice. I attended Jessica's funeral a week later. I felt like I owed it to her, since I was possibly the last person she'd communicated with. Her family was devastated, of course, but they were grateful that the killers had been caught so quickly. They thanked me for calling the police, though I never told them about the supernatural aspect of my encounter with their daughter. Jessica's mother mentioned during the service that her daughter had always been someone who looked out for others, always trying to help people even when it put her at risk. She would have wanted to make sure no one else got hurt, her mother said. That's just who Jessica was. Those words stayed with me because they perfectly described what I'd experienced. Even in death, Jessica was still trying to protect people, still trying to make sure that justice was done. I got the job in San Antonio and ended up moving there permanently, but I made sure to take a different route for future trips. I couldn't bring myself to drive past that gas station again, knowing what had happened there, and knowing that I'd been contacted by someone from beyond the grave. Over the years, I've wondered if Jessica's spirit found peace after her killers were convicted, or if she's still out there somewhere, still trying to help people in danger. I hope she's at rest now, knowing that her death wasn't in vain, and that her final plea for help was heard and answered. Sometimes I think about how many people might have supernatural encounters without realizing it. If I hadn't seen the news report the next morning, I might have dismissed the entire experience as a case of mistaken identity or confusion brought on by exhaustion. But the evidence was undeniable. I had interacted with someone who was already dead, someone whose spirit was strong enough to reach across the barrier between life and death to seek justice. Jessica Martinez was only 23 years old when she died, just trying to make an honest living and support herself. She deserved so much better than what happened to her that night. But I'm grateful that I was able to play some small part in making sure her killers faced consequences for their actions. I'll never forget the sound of her voice calling out for help in that parking lot, or the determination in her spirit to see that justice was done. Some people are so good, so committed to doing what's right, that not even death can stop them from trying to protect others. A few years ago, I was on a business trip with 3 of my colleagues to a conference in Portland, Oregon. We all worked for a tech company based in San Francisco, and since the conference was only about a 6-hour drive, we decided to rent a car and make a road trip out of it rather than fly. We were all immigrants working in the U.S. I'm from India. My colleagues were from China, South Korea, and Brazil, respectively. We'd never been to this part of the Pacific Northwest before, so we were looking forward to seeing some new scenery and maybe stopping at some interesting places along the way. The conference ended on a Friday afternoon, and we decided to drive back to San Francisco that evening so we could have the weekend free. We left Portland around 7 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night and arrive home Saturday morning. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere on Interstate 5 south of Salem, we started talking about being hungry. We'd been so busy with conference sessions that we'd barely had time for lunch, and now we were all craving some snacks and drinks for the long drive ahead. My colleague Jin, who was driving, said he'd keep an eye out for a gas station or convenience store where we could stock up on road trip supplies. The problem was, this stretch of highway was pretty rural, with long gaps between towns and services. We drove for another 20 minutes or so without seeing anything, when finally we spotted lights in the distance that looked like they might be a gas station. Jin slowed down and pulled off the highway toward what appeared to be a small, older-style service station. The place had a distinctly retro feel to it, like something from the 1970s or 80s that had been frozen in time. The gas pumps were the old kind where you had to go inside to pay first, and the convenience store looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Jin and I went inside while our other 2 colleagues stayed in the car to stretch their legs and check their phones. The store was dimly lit and had that musty smell of a place that didn't get much ventilation. The shelves were sparsely stocked, and everything looked like it had been sitting there for years. There was an elderly woman behind the counter, probably in her 60s, who smiled at us pleasantly but never said a word. She just watched us as we browsed the limited selection of snacks and drinks. The whole atmosphere felt off somehow. The products on the shelves looked old-fashioned brands I remembered from my childhood but hadn't seen in years. The prices seemed way too low for current standards, but we were hungry and didn't want to drive another hour looking for a better option. I picked up a bag of peanuts, and Jin grabbed a large bag of chips that we could share. When we got to the counter to pay, the woman rang us up with this strange, constant smile, but she never spoke to us or made eye contact in a normal way. The total came to $3.50, which seemed impossibly cheap even for the middle of nowhere. Jin paid with exact change, and we left the store. Back in the car, we opened our purchases and immediately realized something was very wrong. The food tasted terrible, not just stale, but actually rotten. When we checked the expiration dates, we discovered that both items had expired in 1986. We were in the year 2019 at the time. So these products were over 30 years past their expiration date. "That's impossible," said my colleague Maria from Brazil. "How could they be selling food that expired in the 80s? "Maybe the dates are printed wrong," suggested David from South Korea. "Some countries use different date formats." But when we examined the packages more closely, there was no mistaking it. The food we just purchased had been sitting on those shelves for decades. We all agreed that the whole situation was bizarre, but we were tired and wanted to get home. So we threw the expired food away and continued our drive. We made jokes about the time-warp gas station and chalked it up to a weird experience in rural Oregon. 2 days later, David mentioned that he was curious about what we'd encountered and wanted to look up the location to see if other people had similar experiences. He'd saved the GPS coordinates when we'd stopped there, so he pulled up the location on Google Maps. According to the satellite view, there was nothing at those coordinates except empty forest. No gas station, no building, no paved area, just trees and wilderness. "That can't be right," Jin said. "Let me check the GPS history in the rental car." Sure enough, the car's navigation system showed that we'd made a stop at those exact coordinates. But when we looked at the current satellite imagery and street view, there was absolutely no evidence that any kind of structure had ever existed there. "Maybe the satellite images are old," Maria suggested. "Or maybe they demolished the station since we were there." But even the most recent Google Street View images from just a few months earlier showed nothing but undeveloped forest land. There was no evidence of any recent construction or demolition. No access road, no cleared area where a building might have stood. We decided to do some research into the history of that area. After spending several hours searching through local records and news archives, David found something that made our blood run cold. In 1987, there had been a small gas station at approximately that location. Not exactly the same coordinates, but close enough. It had been owned and operated by an elderly couple named Martha and Harold Brennan. According to a newspaper article from that time, they'd both died in a carbon monoxide leak at their home above the station. The business had closed permanently after their deaths, and the building had been demolished shortly thereafter. The article included a photo of the Brennans, and Martha looked remarkably similar to the woman who had served us at the counter. The same age, the same facial features, even the same style of clothing. So we bought 30-year-old food from a woman who died 30 years ago at a gas station that was demolished 30 years ago, I said, trying to make sense of what we'd discovered. None of us knew what to make of it. We were all educated, rational people who worked in technology. We didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but the evidence was undeniable. We'd all experienced the same thing. We had the GPS records to prove we'd stopped somewhere, and we'd physically interacted with products that couldn't have existed in the present day. Maybe we somehow slipped into a different time, Jin suggested. Like we drove through some kind of temporal anomaly. Or maybe we were all hallucinating from road trip fatigue, Maria said, though she didn't sound convinced by her own explanation. David had a different theory. In some Asian cultures, we believe that strong emotions or traumatic events can leave imprints on a place. Maybe the Brennan spirits are still running their gas station, not realizing that decades have passed. I found that explanation oddly comforting. The idea that Martha and Harold Brennan were still together, still serving travelers, still trying to help people on their journeys. It was sad, but also somehow beautiful. We never figured out a rational explanation for what happened that night. All four of us experienced the same thing, so it wasn't an individual hallucination. The GPS data proved we'd stopped somewhere, even though that somewhere apparently didn't exist in our current reality. Sometimes I wonder if we're the only ones who have had this experience, or if other travelers have stumbled upon the Brennan's eternal gas station during late-night drives through rural Oregon. Maybe there are places where the past and present intersect, where people who lived their entire lives serving others continue that service even after death. I hope Martha and Harold have found peace, but if they haven't, I hope they know that their kindness and hospitality are still appreciated by weary travelers, even if those travelers come from a different time than they remember. I'm writing this anonymously because what happened to me still gives me chills, even though it was over a decade ago. I was just 17 at the time, working the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The station was one of those lonely places you find on state highways, the kind where truckers stop for coffee at 3 in the morning, and travelers fill up before heading into the desert. I worked there pumping gas and cleaning windshields for tips, trying to make enough money to help my family while I finished my GED during the day. The station was about 15 miles outside the city limits, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and darkness once the sun went down. My shift partner was a guy named Rodriguez, a 40-something veteran who'd been working nights for years. He had a beat-up pickup truck and would give me rides to the main road after our shift ended, where I'd catch the early morning bus back to town. It was a Tuesday night in late October, around 3:30 in the morning. The desert was dead quiet except for the occasional semi-rumbling passed on the highway. Rodriguez was restocking cigarettes behind the counter, while I was cleaning the pump areas when a black sedan, with heavily tinted windows, pulled up to my station. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged woman with shoulder-length brown hair. She seemed pleasant enough, asking me to fill up her tank. As I started pumping, she got out and mentioned she needed to grab some snacks for her son who was sleeping in the backseat. She asked if I could keep an eye on him while she went inside. Of course, no problem, I told her, and she smiled this wide smile that seemed a little too enthusiastic. Something about the way she kept grinning as she walked toward the store made me uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. The backseat windows were so dark I could barely make out anything inside, but I could see some movement, just shadows shifting around. The kid must have been restless. I finished filling the tank and stood waiting, occasionally glancing at the car. The movement in the back seemed odd, almost mechanical. But I figured the child was just fidgeting in his sleep. After about 10 minutes, the woman came out carrying 2 plastic bags full of candy bars, chips, and sodas. She was still wearing that unnaturally wide smile, and it was starting to really creep me out. The way she looked at me while walking back to her car felt predatory, like she was studying me. When she reached me, she asked, "Is my son still back there?" pointing to the rear of the car. "Yeah, he's been moving around a bit, but he's there," I replied. She paid for the gas and even gave me a $5 tip for watching him. Then she got into the driver's seat, turned around, and started talking to the backseat in this sickeningly sweet voice. "Look at all the treats I got for you, sweetheart." I thought she was about to drive away, but instead, she turned to me with that same disturbing smile and said, "I want you to meet my son, Tyler." She pressed a button, and the rear window slowly rolled down. What I saw in that backseat will haunt me for the rest of my life. Sitting there, propped up against the seat, was what looked like a mummified corpse of a teenage boy. The body was so decomposed, it was almost skeletal, dressed in a faded basketball jersey and jeans, with a baseball cap pulled down over what remained of his face. I froze completely. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. This woman was driving around with a dead body, talking to it like it was alive, buying it snacks. The smell that suddenly hit me when that window went down, I'll never forget it. I don't remember exactly how I reacted in those first few seconds. I think I stumbled backward, maybe made some kind of noise. The next thing I knew, Rodriguez was beside me, asking what was wrong. The woman quickly rolled the window back up and drove away without another word, disappearing into the desert darkness. Rodriguez had to shake me to get me to respond. When I finally managed to tell him what I'd seen, he immediately called 911. He gave them a description of the car and the direction she'd headed. Then he drove me home because I was in no condition to work the rest of my shift. The next night, when Rodriguez picked me up, he had news. The police had called the station to thank him for reporting the incident. It turned out they'd been looking for this woman for months. Her family in Nevada had reported her missing after she'd suffered a complete mental breakdown following her teenage son's death from leukemia. She disappeared from the hospital the day after he died, and no one knew where she'd gone or what she'd done with his body. The family had assumed she'd buried him somewhere and then taken off, unable to cope with the grief. But she never buried him. For 8 months, she'd been driving around the Southwest with her son's decomposing body, stopping at gas stations and stores, buying him food and clothes, talking to him like nothing had happened. The police found her 2 days later at a rest stop in New Mexico, still with Tyler in the backseat, still trying to take care of him. I'm 29 now, and I've mostly moved past what happened that night. But sometimes, when I'm filling up my car at a gas station late at night, I remember that woman's smile and the way she introduced me to her son. It reminds me that grief can do terrible things to people, and that some kinds of love can become something monstrous when they refuse to let go. My name is Maria, and I need to share something that happened to me and my best friend during our sophomore year at Arizona State University. This was back in 2012, and I still get goosebumps thinking about that night. I was an exchange student from Mexico, living in the dorms and trying to make the most of my time studying in the States. My roommate was this incredible girl named Carmen from Chile. We'd bonded immediately over being foreigners navigating American college life together. It happened on a Friday night in November. We decided to drive out to Sedona for Carmen's 20th birthday weekend. We'd rented a Honda Civic and planned to stay at this beautiful resort among the red rocks. Our last class ended at 6, so we didn't hit the road until around 8:30, after packing and grabbing dinner. The drive should have taken about 2 hours on Interstate 17, and we were excited about spending the weekend hiking and celebrating. About an hour into the trip, somewhere between Phoenix and Flagstaff, we both needed a bathroom break. I checked my GPS and found a gas station about 5 miles off the highway. When we got there, the place was completely dark. The pumps were covered with plastic bags, and there was a handwritten sign saying, "Closed for repairs." We were desperate, and we noticed the restrooms were in a separate building with their doors propped open. The whole area felt abandoned, just our car in this empty lot surrounded by desert scrub and silence. No other buildings for miles, no traffic sounds, nothing. But we really needed to use the facilities, so we decided to risk it. We parked directly in front of the restroom building and hurried inside. The bathroom was gross but functional, flickering fluorescent lights and graffiti on the walls. We were in and out in less than 5 minutes, but when we stepped back outside, everything changed. Carmen came out first, and I was right behind her, looking down and drying my hands on my jeans. Suddenly, I felt Carmen's hand grab my arm, stopping me in my tracks. She was staring straight ahead with this look of absolute terror on her face. I followed her gaze and saw him. Standing between us and our car, maybe 10 feet away, was this massive figure. He had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the moonlight. His arms hung at his sides, and even though I couldn't make out his face in the shadows, I could feel him watching us. We both froze. For what felt like forever, none of us moved. The silence was deafening, no cars on the distant highway, no wind, no insects. Just this suffocating quiet while this giant man stood motionless, blocking our path to the car. Finally, Carmen whispered, "What do we do?" I had no idea. Going back into the bathroom would be stupid. There was no door to lock, and he could easily follow us in. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal at all. When I told Carmen to check her phone, she reminded me she'd left it in the car charging. We were completely isolated with this person or thing standing between us and any means of escape. His height was so unnatural, it was frightening. Everything about him seemed wrong. Carmen found her courage and shouted at him to leave us alone, to get away from our car. But he just moved his head slowly from side to side, like he was saying no. No expression, no words, just that deliberate head movement that somehow felt more threatening than any shout would have been. I suggested we run the opposite direction and try to flag down help on the highway, but Carmen pointed out we were miles from the main road. We'd driven down a long, dark access road to get here, and on foot in the desert at night, we'd be even more vulnerable. I was shaking uncontrollably, fighting back tears. Carmen stayed strong, positioning herself between me and him, never backing down even though I could tell she was terrified too. I don't know how long we stood there in that standoff. It felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. We saw headlights turning into the gas station, another car pulling into the lot. We immediately started waving and shouting for help, trying to get the driver's attention. But when we looked back to where the tall figure had been standing, he was gone. Vanished completely, like he'd never been there at all. I broke down crying from the relief and leftover terror. Carmen held me while this elderly couple got out of their car They'd seen us waving and came over to ask if we were okay. Carmen explained what had happened while I tried to pull myself together. The strangest part was that the couple said they hadn't seen anyone else when they drove up, just us standing there alone, making frantic gestures for help. They looked around with flashlights, but there was nowhere the figure could have hidden that quickly. We thanked them and got in our car, locking the doors immediately. The whole drive to Sedona, we kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that tall silhouette following us. Even considered turning around and going back to Phoenix, but eventually decided to continue with our plans. The weekend was beautiful, and we did our best to enjoy it, but that encounter cast a shadow over everything. On the drive back, we took the main highway all the way, no stops, no detours, straight through to campus. When we told our friends what happened, everyone had theories. Some thought it was just a vagrant or someone with mental issues. Others suggested it might have been someone with criminal intentions who got scared off by the approaching car. But a few of our friends said what we'd started to suspect ourselves, that what we encountered wasn't entirely human. Arizona has a lot of strange stories, things the government supposedly keeps quiet. After that night, Carmen and I became convinced that we'd stumbled into something that was meant to stay hidden in the desert darkness. I'm a 48-year-old woman who's been wrestling with this story for years, unsure whether to share it publicly. It involves someone I love deeply, my mother, and an experience so unsettling that I still question my own sanity. But I need to tell someone, and maybe you can help me understand what really happened. It was New Year's Eve weekend, 2018. My family was driving from Dallas to Santa Fe for a holiday vacation. There were 6 of us packed into our SUV, my parents, my husband, myself, and our 2 teenage kids. We'd planned to explore the art galleries and historic sites around New Mexico, making it a memorable end-of-year trip. The drive was longer than expected, and by the time we hit the Texas-New Mexico border, it was well past midnight. I really needed a restroom break, so I asked my husband to pull over at the next gas station we found. We stopped at one of those isolated highway stations, the kind that sits alone under harsh fluorescent lights, with nothing but empty desert stretching in all directions. Everyone else in the car was either asleep or half asleep, except for my husband and our younger son, who was playing games on his phone. I decided to go in alone while they waited. The station was nearly empty, except for one other vehicle pulling away as I walked inside. The attendant was behind bulletproof glass, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I found the women's restroom in the back of the building. The bathroom was typical for a highway stop, sterile and echoing, with fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly. I went into one of the stalls and was taking care of business when I heard the main door open with its distinctive squeak. Through the gap under my stall door, I could see someone's feet and legs. I recognized the shoes, immediately brown leather flats that my mother had worn for the entire trip. And those khaki pants, the same ones she'd put on that morning. It was definitely her. "Mom, I'm in here," I called out. "Good thing you decided to use the restroom too, since we still have several hours of driving ahead." No response. "Mom," I tried again. "Why aren't you answering me?" Still nothing, but I could see her feet were still there, just standing in front of the sinks. It was odd behavior for her. She was usually chatty, especially when it was just the 2 of us. "Mom, you're starting to worry me," I said, getting concerned. "Are you feeling okay?" Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. She started crying. Not just tears, but deep, heartbroken sobbing. I knew that voice. It was unmistakably my mother's cry, the same sound I'd heard during the worst moments of her life. I quickly finished up and rushed out of the stall, rushing toward the sound. "Mom, what's wrong? Why are you crying? Please talk to me." But she wouldn't answer. The crying continued, anguished, desperate sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. I started knocking on the stall door where the sound was coming from. "Please open the door, you're scaring me. What happened?" The crying went on, but there was no response to my increasingly frantic pleas. I was starting to panic when I heard the main bathroom door squeak open again. I turned around, and there was my mother, walking in with a concerned expression on her face. My heart stopped. I stared at her, speechless, as she approached me looking worried. "Honey, are you all right? You've been in here for quite a while, and I got concerned," she said, reaching out to touch my hands. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at her, then slowly turned toward the stall where I'd heard the crying. It was silent now. I walked over and pushed the door open. It wasn't even locked. The stall was empty. "What's going on?" my mother asked, genuinely confused by my behavior. "You're pale as a sheet." I could barely find my voice. "Mom, how long have you been in the car?" "The whole time since you went inside," she said. "Nobody else has gotten out. Why?" I told her what had happened, about seeing her shoes, hearing her crying, the entire impossible encounter. She listened with growing bewilderment, asking me several times if I was absolutely certain about what I'd experienced. "That's impossible, sweetie," she kept saying. "I never left the car. No one who looked like me came in here. Are you sure you're feeling okay? You've been driving for a long time, maybe you're just exhausted." I could tell she didn't believe me, and honestly, I was starting to doubt myself. We went back to the car, where my husband immediately noticed my shaken state. I told him I'd explain later, and we continued our journey. I spent the rest of the vacation trying to convince myself it had been hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress. But the experience felt too real, too detailed to dismiss entirely. We had a wonderful time in Santa Fe, and by the time we headed home, the incident had faded to the back of my mind. Life returned to normal work, school, our usual routines. Then, exactly 1 week after we returned home, I got a phone call that shattered my world. It was my father calling to tell me that my mother had died during the night. A massive heart attack in her sleep. She was gone. The grief was overwhelming, but what made it even harder was the question that has haunted me ever since. Was what happened in that restroom somehow connected to her death? Was it a warning of what was coming? Or was it just a terrible coincidence? My husband tells me I need to stop torturing myself with questions that have no answers. That grief can make us see patterns where none exist. But I can't shake the feeling that something was trying to tell me what was about to happen. Sometimes I wonder if that wasn't my mother crying in that stall, but rather some version of me from a week in the future, mourning a loss I didn't yet know was coming. Or maybe it was my mother's spirit, already beginning to slip away, trying to say goodbye. I'll never know for certain what happened in that highway restroom. But I do know that grief has a way of bending reality, of making the impossible feel necessary. Maybe that's all it was, the universe's cruel way of preparing me for the worst phone call of my life. I still think about it every time I'm in a public restroom alone, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, looking for signs of what might be coming next. Because sometimes, I think the people we love find ways to reach us, even when they're not supposed to be there at all. My name is Jose Alberto, and for 3 years I worked the night shift at a truck stop convenience store just outside Bakersfield, California. It was one of those places right off Interstate 5, where long-haul drivers would stop to fuel up and grab coffee before continuing their cross-country routes. I didn't mind the night shift. I've always been a night owl, and the work wasn't particularly demanding. Sure, there were occasional problems with drunk travelers or attempted robberies, but nothing I couldn't handle. What I never expected to encounter, and what I never believed in before that night, was something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. It was a Tuesday in March, around 11:30. I just started my shift and was balancing the register while waiting for my coworker Danny to show up. He was chronically late, but I didn't mind since it gave me time to organize the inventory shipment that had arrived that afternoon. The truck stop was completely empty, no vehicles at the pumps, no customers in the store. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant rumble of trucks on the interstate. I was focused on counting 20s when I heard the electronic chime that signaled someone had entered the store. I looked up but didn't see anyone at first. Then I noticed movement near the candy aisle, a small figure, much shorter than any adult. As I walked around the counter to get a better look, I saw her clearly. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a pink dress that was absolutely filthy. Her hair was matted and tangled, and she was only wearing one shoe, a small white sneaker on her left foot. My first thought was concern for her safety. I quickly scanned the parking lot through the windows, looking for any sign of parents or guardians, but the place was completely deserted. No cars, no people, nothing. How had a child this young gotten here alone in the middle of the night? She approached the counter with uncertain steps, looking lost and frightened. In a small, trembling voice, she asked if I could help her get home because she was lost. She seemed disoriented, like she couldn't remember how she'd gotten there. I knelt down to her eye level and gently asked where her parents were, how she'd ended up at the truck stop. But she just shook her head and shrugged, indicating she didn't know. The poor kid looked exhausted and scared. This was clearly a situation for the authorities. I told her to wait by the door while I called 911 to get help finding her family. She nodded and walked over to stand near the entrance, just watching me with those wide, frightened eyes. I went back to the register where the phone was located, but before I could dial, I heard the door chime again. I looked up, expecting to see the little girl leaving, but instead, Danny was walking in with his usual casual demeanor. "Hey, how's it going?" he said, giving me his typical wave. I was confused. "Danny, didn't you see the little girl who was just standing right there?" I pointed to the door where she'd been waiting. He looked around, genuinely puzzled. "What little girl? There's nobody here but us." I walked back toward the door, past the snack aisles where I'd first seen her, but she was gone. I checked every aisle, looked behind the counter, even checked the small storage room in back. Nothing. "She must have gone outside when you came in," I told Danny. "We need to find her and call the police. She's just a kid, lost and alone." Danny followed me outside, and we searched the entire parking lot and the area around the building. We called out, used our phone flashlights to check behind dumpsters and around the building's corners. There was nowhere she could have gone. The truck stop was surrounded by empty desert for miles. "Are you sure you saw a kid?" Danny asked, looking at me with concern. "When I walked in, I didn't see anyone except you behind the counter." I was getting frustrated and worried. "She was right here, Danny, a little girl in a pink dress missing a shoe. She was lost and scared." But as we continued searching with no sign of her, doubt began creeping in. How could a child simply vanish like that? When we came back inside, Danny suggested we check the security cameras. The truck stop had cameras covering both the interior and exterior of the building. If there really had been a lost child, we'd have it on tape. We pulled up the footage on the small monitor behind the counter. What I saw made my stomach drop. The video showed me talking to empty air, the door opening by itself, me walking around and gesturing at nothing. When the little girl had supposedly entered the store, the footage showed only the door swinging open on its own. When I was talking to her, I was speaking to an empty space. When I thought she was standing by the door, there was nothing there. Danny stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. "Dude, that's really messed up," he said, his voice shaky. I felt sick, not just from fear, but from the complete disconnection between what I'd experienced and what the cameras had recorded. The little girl had been as real to me as Danny was now. I'd seen her, heard her voice, noticed details like her missing shoe and dirty dress. But according to the cameras, I'd been alone the entire time. We told our manager about it the next morning, showing him the footage. He watched it with a grim expression, then asked us not to mention it to anyone else. He said the recordings would be deleted, and warned Danny not to post the video he'd secretly taken on his phone, threatening to fire us both if word got out. But honestly, the video was the least of my concerns. What bothered me was the undeniable reality of my interaction with that little girl. She'd been there, I'd talked to her, seen her fear, wanted to help her. Yet somehow, she'd existed in a space that security cameras couldn't capture. I kept working at the truck stop for several more months, but I never stopped thinking about her. Sometimes, I wondered if she was still lost somewhere, still looking for someone to help her find her way home. And sometimes, late at night when the store was empty, I'd catch myself listening for the sound of that door chime, hoping maybe she'd come back so I could try to help her again. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her either. That little girl in the pink dress taught me that there are things in this world that exist beyond what we can measure or record, things that are real in ways that matter more than what any camera can capture. My name is Jorge, and I'm getting on in years now. Life has taken me down many different roads, but there are some experiences that stay with you no matter how much time passes. This is one of those stories, something that happened decades ago, but feels as fresh as if it occurred yesterday. When I was a young man, I worked at a truck stop on Interstate 40 outside of Amarillo, Texas. It was one of those places that exists in the middle of nowhere, where you rarely see activity during the day. But in the early morning hours, long-haul truckers would roll through on their way to destinations across the country. Working the night shift there was generally peaceful, though it could get lonely when you were the only person awake for miles around. Time moved differently in those small hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. And sometimes you'd find yourself wondering if morning would ever come. I remember one particular incident involving my coworker from the previous shift. When I arrived that afternoon to start my evening shift, Marcus looked like he'd seen death itself. He was pale, shaken, and kept glancing toward the highway like he expected something terrible to appear. At first, he didn't want to talk about what had happened during his overnight shift. But after we'd shared some coffee and he'd calmed down a bit, the story came out. There had been an accident early that morning. A trucker had lost control of his rig just a few hundred yards from our station. The driver was a veteran of the road, a man in his 50s who'd been hauling freight across America for over 30 years. According to Marcus, something had gone wrong with the truck. Maybe the brakes failed, maybe the driver fell asleep. Nobody ever figured out exactly what caused it. But the 18-wheeler had veered off the road and slammed into a concrete barrier at highway speed. Marcus heard the crash. The sound of metal crushing and glass exploding echoed across the desert. When he ran outside to see what had happened, he found a scene that would haunt him for years. The cab of the truck was completely destroyed, compressed against the barrier like an accordion. The driver had been thrown from the vehicle and was lying on the asphalt about 20 feet from the wreckage. Marcus said it was horrible. The man's body was broken, his clothes torn and bloody from the impact. The worst part was that he was still alive when Marcus reached him, still conscious but fading fast. The paramedics arrived within 15 minutes, but it was too late. The trucker died before they could get him to a hospital. Marcus said the man's last words were something about needing to finish his run, that he had a deadline to meet in Oklahoma City. After that night, strange things started happening at the truck stop. At first, it was just small occurrences that we attributed to coincidence or imagination. Marcus mentioned feeling like someone was watching him during his shifts, seeing shadows move in his peripheral vision near the highway. A few days later, another employee reported the same thing. A sense of being observed from the direction of the accident site, especially during the early morning hours when the crash had occurred. Then people started seeing an actual figure walking along the shoulder of the highway. It didn't take long before I saw him myself. I was restocking the coffee station around 2:30 in the morning when something made me look toward the road. There, walking slowly along the edge of the asphalt, was a man in clothes that looked torn and dirty. His gait was wrong. He moved like someone who was badly injured, dragging one foot behind him and favoring his left side. Even from a distance, I could tell this wasn't just some random traveler. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he moved, like he was lost and searching for something he couldn't find. I knew immediately who it was, the trucker. My first instinct was to go outside and see if he needed help, but something deep in my gut told me to stay inside. I watched from the window as he continued his slow progress along the highway, heading in the same direction his truck had been traveling when it crashed. This became a nightly occurrence. Every night, sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, he would appear and make the same journey along the highway. Always alone, always moving with that injured gait, always heading east toward his unfinished destination. None of us talked about it openly at first, but eventually it became an unspoken understanding among the night shift workers. We all knew what we were seeing, and we all agreed on the same unwritten rule: watch from inside, but don't go out to meet him. The appearance continued for exactly 1 month. Every single night, like clockwork, the trucker would walk his route. He never acknowledged the truck stop, never looked in our direction, never deviated from his path. He was focused on something none of us could see, driven by a purpose that death hadn't been able to stop. Then one night in late September, something changed. A pickup truck pulled into our parking lot around midnight, and 3 people got out, 2 middle-aged women and an older man. They walked straight to the spot where the accident had occurred. They carried flowers, a small wooden cross, and several candles. For about an hour, they held what appeared to be a memorial service at the crash site. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see they were grieving, paying their respects to someone they'd lost. When they finished and drove away, something felt different about the place. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the truck stop for a month seemed to lift, like a weight had been removed from the air. That night, for the first time in 30 days, the trucker didn't appear, and he never appeared again. I can't explain what happened or why the memorial service seemed to end his nightly walks. Maybe his spirit had been trapped there, unable to move on until someone properly acknowledged his death. Maybe he'd been waiting for his family to say goodbye. Or maybe he'd finally accepted that his last run was over, that it was time to rest. Whatever the reason, the highway returned to normal after that night. The night shifts went back to being quiet and uneventful, without the unsettling presence of our walking companion. But even though the trucker stopped appearing, something about that stretch of highway never felt quite the same. It's like the asphalt remembers what happened there, and on certain nights when the wind is right, you can almost feel the echo of his presence, still trying to complete that final delivery that death interrupted. I've always wondered if he ever made it to Oklahoma City, wherever truckers go when their earthly roots come to an end. I hope he did. A man who drove those roads for 30 years deserved to finish his last run, even if it took him a month after dying to figure out how to let go. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.